For most of us, the story of Avatar ended when the credits rolled on the final episode. But what if I told you that we only saw a fraction of the real story? There are entire chapters of lore that exist, just not on your TV screen. We're going to dive into the lost stories that completely recontextualize the timeline. And honestly, there is a reason some of these things didn't make it to the screen. After this video, you won't look at the series, or the characters, the same way again. If you are ready to dive deep into the lost episodes, please like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you wish the animated show had continued with a season 4? Or was the ending perfect for you? I'm honestly torn on this. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, let's begin. Picture this. 4 massive temples perched on mountains so high they kissed the clouds. Courtyards echoing with laughter as young monks played airball, sending spheres spinning through hoops with nothing but breath and motion. Gardens where fruit grew year-round because airbenders could coax warmth from the atmosphere itself. And everywhere, sky bison lounging like enormous flying cats, groaning contentedly while children braided their fur and whispered secrets into their ears. This was the air nomad golden age. Not a kingdom, not an empire, just peace. For thousands of years before Sozin's comet turned their world to ash, the air nomads lived simply. They had no armies, no borders, no concept of conquest. The 4 temples, northern, southern, eastern and western, served as home bases, but the philosophy was in the name, nomad. Airbenders wandered. They meditated on mountaintops, visited other nations, studied with spirits in remote valleys, and always came home to share what they'd learned. The temples themselves were architectural marvels, built into cliffsides and peaks that would make modern engineers weep. Spiraling towers, open-air meditation pavilions, and landing pads for sky bison carved right into the rock. But here's the thing, they weren't fortresses. There were no walls, no gates, no guards. Why would there be? The air nomads believed that disconnection from the material world brought you closer to spiritual truth. Possessions weighed you down. Conflict clouded your mind. Attachment was the enemy of enlightenment. So they lived communally, sharing everything. Meals prepared together, chores rotating daily, and decisions made through consensus rather than hierarchy. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to study, meditation, and mastering airbending, not as a weapon, but as an extension of their philosophy. Every gust of wind, every controlled breath, every impossible leap was a prayer in motion. And here's something wild. Every single air nomad was a bender. Not most of them. Not the talented ones. All of them. The canonical explanation? They were so deeply spiritual, so connected to the energy of the universe, that bending wasn't just a skill. It was inevitable. Imagine an entire nation where the impossible was just Tuesday. Daily life revolved around routines that sound almost impossibly peaceful now. Sunrise meditation sessions where hundreds of monks breathed in unison, their exhalations creating winds that made the prayer flags dance. Afternoon training where the youngest airbenders learned to run across walls and leap between towers, giggling when they inevitably face-planted into piles of monk gyatso's strategically placed fruit pies. Evenings spent in the libraries transcribing wisdom, debating philosophy, or, if you were gyatso, teaching the kids that enlightenment and fun weren't mutually exclusive. Because that was the secret the air nomads understood better than anyone. Joy and wisdom weren't opposites. You could be deeply spiritual and still laugh until your ribs hurt. You could seek enlightenment and still love pay-show games, terrible jokes, and sneaking extra desserts when the elder monks weren't looking. The sky bison were more than transportation. They were partners. Every young airbender would eventually bond with a bison calf, and that connection lasted a lifetime. They'd fly together across continents, the bison responding to the gentlest airbending nudge or sometimes just vibes. No reins, no commands, just trust. Festivals marked the seasons. The autumn equinox brought celebrations where airbenders would create spectacular wind sculptures, dragons made of leaves, phoenixes formed from coloured sand, entire stories told through controlled currents that danced above the temples. Winter solstice meant journeys to the spirit world's thresholds, where the most spiritually attuned could cross over and return with wisdom. Spring welcomed new bison calves and new students, both equally chaotic. But here's where it gets complicated. As centuries passed, the air nomads grew more isolated. What started as healthy detachment from materialism became something else, a disconnection from the world's problems. Other nations faced wars, famines, political upheaval. The air nomads meditated. They offered wisdom when asked, housed the avatar when duty called, but increasingly they retreated into their mountaintop sanctuary. Critics from other nations started calling them out. Easy to be peaceful when you live in the clouds, they'd say. Easy to preach non-attachment when you've never had to fight for anything. The air nomads would respond with some profound saying about how true peace comes from within, which, let's be honest, probably didn't help the out-of-touch monks' accusations. Were they right to isolate? Were they wrong to avoid the world's conflicts? That's the kind of question that doesn't have clean answers. Maybe their pacifism was enlightened wisdom. Maybe it was privileged ignorance. Maybe it was both, tangled together like the wind currents they rode. What we know for certain is this. They were happy. They were free. They'd built a civilization where every person could fly, where violence was foreign, where children grew up believing the world was fundamentally good. And then Firelord Sozin proved them tragically, catastrophically wrong. But before that day came, before the comet, before the genocide, before Aang woke up to a world that had forgotten how to be gentle, there were centuries of sunrise meditations and sky bison races and fruit pies shared between teachers who loved their students more than empires loved power. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't just what was destroyed, it's remembering what we lost, and knowing we'll never build anything quite like it again. Long before he became Aang's mentor, before he was a master airbender, before he earned the respect of every monk in the Southern Air Temple, Gyatso was a kid who couldn't bend. Well, that's not entirely accurate. He could bend, he just couldn't control it. According to records from Avatar Roku's time, young Gyatso showed incredible talent when his airbending first manifested. Wind responded to his emotions, his gestures, his intentions. The elder monks whispered that he might become one of the greatest airbenders of his generation. And then, seemingly overnight, it stopped working. His airbending would only activate during moments of extreme danger, life or death situations where instinct overrode everything else. But the controlled, meditative bending that defined the air nomads, the graceful movements, the spiritual connection, gone. For a kid growing up in a culture where literally everyone could airbend, where your connection to the element reflected your spiritual enlightenment, this wasn't just frustrating. It was devastating. The reason? Grief. Gyatso had lost his sister, and the pain of that loss anchored him to the material world in a way that violated everything the air nomads taught. Detachment, non-attachment, letting go. These weren't just philosophical concepts, they were supposed to be the foundation of your entire existence. And young Gyatso couldn't do it. Every time he tried to meditate to find that spiritual center that would unlock his bending, he'd crash into the memory of her. The attachment wouldn't release. The other monks tried to help. They offered wisdom, meditation techniques, breathing exercises. Let go of earthly tether, enter the void, empty, and become wind. All the greatest hits, and Gyatso would nod and smile and try and fail. Here's where it gets interesting. Most airbenders in his position would have doubled down on the spiritual path, meditating harder, detaching further, forcing themselves into the philosophical mould. Gyatso went the opposite direction. If he couldn't be the perfect detached monk, maybe he could be something else. Something the air nomads desperately needed but didn't quite realize yet. Human. He started making jokes during meditation sessions. Not disruptive, just present. A well-timed observation, a gentle absurdity that would make the other monks try not to laugh while maintaining their breathing exercises. He'd accidentally airbend fruit pies into the faces of overly serious students, teaching them that enlightenment and laughter weren't enemies. He became the monk who questioned every rigid tradition, who asked but why, when elders proclaimed absolute truths. And somewhere in that journey, between the grief he couldn't release and the joy he refused to abandon, his airbending came back. Not because he let go, because he found balance. During his youth, Gyatso became friends with someone who would change the entire world, Avatar Roku. When Roku began his avatar training, travelling to each nation to master the elements, he spent time at the air temples learning airbending, and he and Gyatso bonded over something the elder monks probably didn't advertise in their recruitment scrolls. They both sucked at detachment. Roku couldn't let go of his connection to the Fire Nation, to his homeland, to his best friend Sozin. Gyatso couldn't let go of personal attachments, of the people he loved, of the belief that caring deeply about individuals wasn't a spiritual weakness. They were supposed to be flaws. But together, these two found strength in them. Years later, when the monks chose Gyatso to become young Aang's guardian and mentor, some of the elders objected. Too attached, they said. Too playful. Too willing to bend the rules along with the air. But that's exactly why Gyatso was chosen. Because Aang wasn't going to be a normal kid. He was the Avatar. And he needed someone who understood that loving people, really deeply loving them, wasn't something to transcend. It was something to protect. Gyatso taught Aang airbending, yes. The forms, the philosophy, the connection between breath and motion. But more importantly, he taught him joy. They'd race through the temple corridors on air scooters, play airball until sunset, sneak extra desserts from the kitchens, and laugh so hard the wind itself seemed to giggle in response. According to Aang, Gyatso was the greatest airbender alive. Not because he could create the biggest tornadoes or pull off the most impressive techniques, because he understood what all those elder monks forgot somewhere in their 10,000 meditations. Bending wasn't about power, it was about connection, to the element, to the world, to the people you loved. When the other monks discovered Aang was the Avatar 4 years early, because storm clouds were gathering and war was coming, they made a decision. Separate the boy from his mentor. Send Aang to the Eastern Air Temple to complete his training under stricter, more traditional masters. Their reasoning? Gyatso's love for Aang would cloud his judgment. His attachment would interfere with the Avatar's development. The boy needed discipline, not friendship. Destiny, not laughter. Gyatso fought it. Quietly, respectfully, but absolutely. He knew what the other monks couldn't see. Aang didn't need more detachment training. He needed someone who would remind him that being the Avatar didn't mean stopping being human, that saving the world wasn't worth it if you lost yourself in the process. But the council decided Aang would be sent away. That night, a 12-year-old boy overheard the conversation. Terrified of losing the only family he'd ever known, Aang ran, grabbed Appa, fled into a storm and ended up frozen in an iceberg for 100 years. Gyatso never saw him again. When Sozin's comet arrived and the Fire Nation attacked, Gyatso died defending the Southern Air Temple. His body was found surrounded by Fire Nation soldiers, at least 10 to 15 of them, all fallen in the same room. No burns on his robes, no signs of a conventional fight, just a master airbender and the people he'd stopped, even if it cost him everything. The theory? He'd removed all the air from the sealed chamber, suffocating his attackers, suffocating himself. It was the most un-air nomad thing imaginable, taking lives, even in self-defense. But it was also the most Gyatso thing possible, protecting others, creating an opportunity for someone, somewhere to escape, sacrificing himself so the next generation might have a chance. In his final moments, the monk who struggled with detachment proved that attachment wasn't weakness. Love wasn't a flaw. Caring so deeply that you'd give everything to protect it, that wasn't something to transcend. That was something worth dying for. Decades later, when a 100-year-old, 12-year-old boy would refuse to kill Fire Lord Ozai, when he'd find a third option that everyone said was impossible, when he'd save the world without losing his soul, that was Gyatso's final lesson, echoing across a century of ice. Sometimes the greatest wisdom isn't learning to let go. It's knowing what to hold on to, even when the entire world tells you to release your grip. 16 years old, Fire Nation royalty, best friends with the Crown Prince, a promising future as a master firebender, maybe a general, maybe an advisor to the throne. Life mapped out, neat and tidy, with zero complications. And then 4 old men show up at your door with glowing relics and life-ruining news. Congratulations, you're the Avatar. Pack your bags, say goodbye to everything you know, and prepare to spend the next decade wandering the world while everyone you love moves on without you. This was Roku's 16th birthday present. In Fire Nation tradition, and really across all 4 nations, The Avatar's identity was revealed at 16. Not earlier, despite the sages knowing from childhood who carried Rava's spirit. The logic? Let the kid be a kid first. Give them a chance to form an identity, make friends, discover who they are before the weight of 10,000 years of cosmic responsibility crushes them into a very spiritually enlightened pancake. Roku took the news about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, not great. The reveal ceremony itself was straightforward. 4 toys placed in front of young Roku years earlier, one from each nation, each belonging to a past avatar. Without hesitation, without explanation, toddler Roku had chosen all 4. The sages marked their calendars and waited. On his 16th birthday, they performed the formal ritual, and Roku's life as just a talented firebender officially ended. His best friend Sozin, future Fire Lord, future war criminal, future reason the entire world would burn, threw him a going-away party. They laughed. They made promises about staying in touch, about Roku returning to serve the Fire Nation as its avatar. They were kids. They had no idea what was coming. The training began immediately. Roku travelled to the Earth Kingdom to learn earthbending, then to the Water Tribe for waterbending, finally to the Air Nomads for airbending. Each element took years. Each master pushed him beyond what he thought possible, and each step took him further from the Fire Nation, from his home, from Sozin. But here's the thing about mastering elements. It's not just learning to punch with rocks or turn water into ice sculptures. Each bending discipline carries a philosophy, a worldview, a completely different way of understanding existence. Fire is passion and drive. Earth is stability and stubbornness. Water is adaptability and change. Air is freedom and detachment. Roku had to become all of them, which meant breaking down who he was and rebuilding himself piece by piece. The hardest part? Airbending. Because Fire Nation philosophy and Air Nomad philosophy are basically opposites, having a philosophical cage match. Fire Nation culture prized strength, ambition, legacy, attachment to your nation, your family, your honour. The Air Nomads taught detachment, non-violence, letting go of earthly desires. For Roku, learning to airbend meant confronting everything his culture had taught him was valuable, and being told, yeah, all that? Let it go. He struggled, hard. According to records from that era, Roku's airbending training took longer than any other element. His teachers, including his friend Gyatso, had to essentially deprogram years of Fire Nation conditioning before Roku could even begin to understand what airbending required, and then came the Avatar state. Nobody tells you about this part in the recruitment scroll. The Avatar state isn't something you learn. It's something that erupts out of you during moments of extreme danger or overwhelming emotion. It's every past avatar channeling their power through your body simultaneously, turning you into a cosmic blender of elemental fury that could level mountains and redirect oceans. The first time it happened to Roku, he nearly killed his earthbending master. They were training, advanced techniques, high-stakes sparring, and something went wrong. Maybe Roku got pushed too far. Maybe trauma from leaving his home finally surfaced. Maybe the stress of carrying an entire civilization's hopes just hit different that day. Whatever the trigger, his eyes glowed, wind and fire and earth and water swirled around him in a maelstrom, and suddenly, young Roku wasn't young Roku anymore. He was every avatar who'd ever lived, and they were very, very angry. His master barely contained the damage. When Roku came back to himself, he was horrified. This power, this infinite, uncontrollable power, lived inside him, and he had no idea how to stop it from erupting. Learning to control the avatar state would take years. Some avatars never mastered it. Those who did described it as finding the eye of a hurricane, that perfect calm center where you can access the power without being consumed by it. Roku eventually got there, but the journey involved a lot of accidentally destroyed training grounds and very patient mentors who probably deserved hazard pay. But the real awakening wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. As Roku travelled the world, he saw things Fire Nation propaganda never mentioned. Earth Kingdom villages struggling under corrupt leaders, Water Tribe families displaced by territorial disputes, Air Nomads living in peace while the other nations squabbled over resources and borders. The world wasn't the neat, ordered place his childhood lessons had described. It was messy, complicated, often unfair, and now it was his job to fix it. All of it. Forever. There's a loneliness to being the avatar that nobody talks about. You're surrounded by people, masters, allies, friends, but you're fundamentally alone. Your decisions affect millions. Your failures echo through generations, and when you die, you're reborn into a new body with no memory of your past life, forced to learn everything again from scratch, while the world watches and judges and demands you be perfect immediately. Roku understood this during a quiet moment at the Western Air Temple. Watching the sunset, probably contemplating the weight of his new existence, he realized he would never just be Roku again. He was the Avatar first, Fire Nation citizen second, individual person a distant third. Some might call that enlightenment. Others might call it tragedy. Roku called it duty and got back to training. Years later, when he returned to the Fire Nation as a fully realized Avatar, Sozin was Fire Lord. Their reunion was warm, nostalgic. Two old friends reminiscing about simpler times. But something had changed. Sozin had spent those years consolidating power, expanding borders, dreaming of a Fire Nation empire that would unify the world under his rule. Roku had spent those years learning that no single nation should hold that much power. Their friendship wouldn't survive the philosophical gap. But on that first day back, before the betrayals and the volcano and the century of war, there was just a moment. Two boys who'd grown into men, hoping somehow they could still be friends despite becoming opposing forces in a cosmic balance. Roku's awakening as the Avatar wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unravelling of everything he'd been, a painful rebuilding into something greater, and the eventual acceptance that being the bridge between worlds meant never fully belonging to any of them. He carried that burden for decades, did his best, made mistakes. Trusted the wrong people, specifically one Fire Lord who would betray him, leave him to die, and ignite a war that wouldn't end until a bald kid with arrows woke up in an iceberg a century later. But that first awakening, that moment when the sages revealed his destiny and 16-year-old Roku realized his life was no longer his own, that's where it all started. The moment everything changed and the world gained a protector it didn't know it desperately needed. Even if that protector was just a confused teenager who really, really missed his best friend and wondered if cosmic responsibility was worth losing everything that made you human. Spoiler alert, the answer is complicated, and Roku spent his entire life figuring it out. Somewhere in the middle of the Earth Kingdom, there's a swamp so dense that sunlight barely touches the water. The air hangs thick with moisture, and the smell of earth and decay and life all tangled together. Vines wrap around everything. The water moves slow, dark, stained brown by centuries of decomposing vegetation. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can hear the entire place breathing. This is the foggy swamp, and buried deep in its heart lives a tribe of waterbenders that the rest of the world forgot existed. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Not all water tribe members stayed at the poles. Generations ago, maybe centuries, the oral histories get fuzzy on the exact timeline, a group of waterbenders from the southern water tribe packed up their lives and headed south, way south, past the Earth Kingdom borders, past the cities and farmlands, all the way to a massive swamp that seemed to exist outside normal civilization. Why did they leave? The stories vary depending on who's telling them. Some say it was a philosophical split. Disagreements about how waterbenders should live, what traditions mattered, whether isolation at the poles was wisdom or fear. Others whisper about a scandal, a forbidden technique, something that made certain waterbenders unwelcome in traditional water tribe society. A few legends mention a spiritual calling, visions that led a group of benders to seek something the frozen tundra couldn't provide. Whatever the reason, they arrived at the foggy swamp and never left. At first, it must have been brutal. These were people adapted to ice and snow, suddenly dropped into a humid, sweltering environment where everything was wet but nothing was frozen. Traditional waterbending techniques, pulling water from the air, freezing opponents, creating ice barriers, still worked technically. But the swamp demanded something different, something stranger. That's when they discovered the banyan grove tree. Calling it a tree is like calling the ocean some water. The banyan grove tree is one organism spread across the entire swamp, Miles and miles of roots and trunks and branches all connected underground, all sharing the same life force. Touch one tree, and technically you're touching all of them. Cut one root, and the whole system feels it. It's not just alive, it's aware. The waterbenders felt it immediately, that connection. That sense of everything being linked to everything else in ways visible reality couldn't explain. And slowly, over years of living in the swamp, of meditating among the roots, of letting go of their old ways and embracing this new environment, they developed something unprecedented: plant bending. Water exists in plants, in vines, in leaves, in the very cells of living vegetation. The foggy swamp waterbenders learned to feel that water, to manipulate it, to turn the entire swamp into an extension of their will. Vines became whips, roots became barriers, the swamp itself became their partner in a form of bending that no northern or southern waterbender would recognize. Over generations they evolved. Culturally, spiritually, even physically. They abandoned heavy parkas for, well, significantly less clothing. Loincloths mostly. Because humidity and fur don't mix, and also because they'd embraced a philosophy that made traditional water tribe modesty seem ridiculous. They built homes directly into the trees, platforms and structures that grew with the banyan grove, rather than imposing themselves on it. They stopped eating seal jerky, and started eating whatever the swamp provided. Bugs, fish, plants, things that probably shouldn't be edible but somehow were. Their accents changed, their appearance changed. By the time Team Avatar stumbled into the swamp a century into the war, these waterbenders looked nothing like Katara or Sokka. Tanned skin from constant sun exposure, rough hands from working with vines and wood, a drawl in their speech that sounded more Earth Kingdom than Water Tribe. If you didn't see them bend, you'd never guess they shared ancestry with the people at the poles. But that connection to the banyan grove tree, that was where the real magic happened. The tree didn't just connect plants to plants, it connected consciousness to consciousness. The foggy swamp waterbenders discovered they could see visions through the tree's root system. Glimpses of people who mattered to them, even people they'd never met but were spiritually connected to. Past lives, future encounters, moments of significance that the tree somehow knew were important, pulling them up through the roots like memories rising from deep water. When Aang arrived at the swamp, he saw his friends in danger. Katara saw her dead mother. Sokka saw Yue, then Toph, who he hadn't even met yet. The banyan grove tree was showing them what mattered most, pulling on threads of connection that logic couldn't explain. The swamp waterbender's leader, Hu, understood this better than anyone. His whole philosophy, which he delivered while riding a giant swamp monster made of seaweed and vines, because why not, boiled down to one concept. Everything is connected. The tree proved it. You're not separate from the world. You're part of one big organism, all tangled together, all flowing through the same cosmic root system. Sounds like Air Nomad philosophy, right? That detachment, that oneness with the universe. Except the swamp waterbenders came at it from the opposite direction. They didn't achieve connection through letting go. They achieved it through sinking deeper. Into the mud, into the roots, into the messy, tangled, complicated reality of being alive and part of something bigger than yourself. It's the most water tribe thing imaginable. Adapting. Taking your culture, your bending, your entire identity, and reshaping it to fit the environment. The Northern Water Tribe built walls and traditions to preserve themselves exactly as they were. The Southern Water Tribe nearly got wiped out holding on to their identity. The Foggy Swamp Tribe, they let the swamp change them, and in doing so, they survived. Are they still really Water Tribe? Depends who you ask. Katara seemed pretty skeptical at first. These weird swamp people with their plant bending and their lack of pants and their bizarre spiritual philosophies didn't match anything she'd learned about her heritage. But then she watched them bend, felt the same connection to water she'd known her whole life, and realised, yeah, different branches, same tree, literally in this case. The banyan grove tree had become their new tribe, their home, their spiritual centre, their connection to something larger than individual survival. They'd traded the harsh beauty of ice and snow for the humid chaos of the swamp, and in doing so they'd discovered a form of waterbending and a way of life that was uniquely theirs. The rest of the world forgot they existed. No representatives at tribal councils, no alliance during the war, no acknowledgement that Water Tribe didn't just mean polar ice caps. But the foggy swamp waterbenders didn't care. They had everything they needed right there in the muck and the vines and the breathing, living connection of the banyan grove tree. Sometimes being forgotten isn't tragedy. Sometimes it's freedom. The freedom to grow differently, to bend rules along with elements, to prove that your culture isn't defined by staying the same. It's defined by adapting while keeping the core of who you are alive. Even if that core now includes significantly more humidity, questionable fashion choices, and the occasional swamp monster made of seaweed. The banyan grove tree remembers them, and in a world where everything is connected, where roots run deeper than borders, and life flows through channels invisible to the eye, maybe that's the only tribe that really matters. Imagine a library so vast that you could spend a lifetime reading and never touch a fraction of its collection. Towers of scrolls reaching toward vaulted ceilings, maps of lands that no longer existed, texts written in languages forgotten by the living world, scientific treatises on everything from astronomy to medicine, poetry that could make spirits weep, historical accounts from every nation, every era, every corner of the world, all preserved, catalogued, and guarded by a spirit who called himself He Who Knows 10,000 Things. This was Wan Shitong's library, and once upon a time it was humanity's greatest treasure. The library didn't start in a desert. That's where Team Avatar found it, buried in sand, half-sunken, angry and abandoned. But centuries earlier, the library existed in a place between the physical and spirit worlds, accessible to anyone with genuine thirst for knowledge. Scholars made pilgrimages from every nation, Water Tribe historians seeking to document their oral traditions, Earth Kingdom scientists studying geology and metallurgy, Fire Nation philosophers debating ethics and governance, Air Nomad monks transcribing spiritual wisdom. They came with questions, they left with answers, and Wan Shitong welcomed them all. The spirit himself was magnificent, a massive black and white owl whose wingspan could blot out the sun, whose eyes held the accumulated wisdom of millennia. He moved through his library with pride, sometimes in owl form, sometimes manifesting as a more manageable presence to speak with scholars directly. His voice carried the weight of ages, but also something unexpected. Hope. Hope that humanity would use knowledge wisely. That information, freely shared across borders, would bring the world closer to enlightenment. The library's assistants were knowledge seekers, fox spirits who scurried through the stacks, retrieving requested texts, guiding lost researchers, occasionally pranking overly serious academics by hiding their reading glasses. They were extensions of Wan Shitong's will, but also independent beings who genuinely loved learning and loved watching humans discover things that made their eyes light up with understanding. Inside, the collection was staggering. Ancient calendars tracking celestial events across thousands of years, bestiaries documenting every creature that had ever walked, swam, flown or burrowed, architectural diagrams for buildings that defied physics, complete genealogies of royal families, agricultural techniques for climates that no longer existed, battle strategies, peace treaties, love letters, philosophical debates, everything humanity had ever thought, discovered, or created, preserved for eternity. There were sections dedicated to each nation's bending arts, carefully documenting techniques and philosophies, not to weaponize them, to understand them, to appreciate how water flows, how earth endures, how fire transforms, how air liberates. To see bending not as tools of war but as expressions of human connection to the natural world. Scholars from opposing nations would sit at the same tables, sharing insights, debating theories, forming friendships that transcended political boundaries. A Fire Nation engineer might collaborate with an Earth Kingdom metallurgist to design better irrigation systems. A Water Tribe healer might compare notes with an Air Nomad herbalist about medicinal properties of rare plants. Knowledge didn't recognize borders. Inside Wan Shitong's library, you weren't Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom. You were a scholar, a seeker, someone who believed that understanding the world made it better. Wan Shitong encouraged this. He'd appear during particularly heated debates, offering an ancient text that would reframe the entire discussion. He'd guide researchers toward connections they hadn't considered. Sometimes he'd simply observe, his massive owl eyes gleaming with something that might have been pride, watching humans elevate themselves through learning. But there was a rule. One absolute non-negotiable rule that every scholar agreed to upon entering. Knowledge gained here must be used for the betterment of humanity, never for destruction. You can probably guess where this is going. The exact moment of betrayal is lost to time, but the pattern was clear. Generals disguised as historians, researching not to understand but to conquer. Warriors studying ancient battle strategies, not to prevent war but to win it. Engineers taking architectural knowledge and weaponizing it into siege engines. Over and over, people entered the library promising enlightenment and left with blueprints for devastation. Wan Shutong tried to believe in humanity. He'd confront those who violated his trust, explain that knowledge without wisdom was destruction, offer second chances. The scholars would nod, agree, promise to do better, and then return to their nations and use everything they'd learned to kill each other more efficiently. The breaking point came during one of the many pre-100-year war conflicts. A military commander had disguised himself as a professor of history, spent months researching defensive fortifications across the Earth Kingdom. Wan Shutong's fox spirits grew suspicious. This professor showed no interest in why fortifications were built, only in their weaknesses. When confronted, the commander laughed. Called the spirit naive for believing humans wanted peace when power was so much more satisfying. He left with his research. Within a year, 3 Earth Kingdom cities fell using the exact vulnerabilities he'd discovered in Wan Shutong's library. That was it. The spirit who'd spent centuries believing in humanity's better nature finally accepted the truth. They would always weaponize knowledge, always twist learning into leverage, always choose destruction over enlightenment when given the option. Wan Shutong made his decision. If humanity couldn't be trusted with knowledge, they wouldn't have access to it. He began moving his library, not destroying it, because the knowledge itself was still precious, but hiding it. First, he relocated it fully to the physical world, specifically to the most inhospitable location he could find, the Siwong Desert. Then he started sinking it, pulling it down into the sand where only the truly desperate would think to look. The scholars who'd used the library honourably protested. They'd done nothing wrong. Why were they being punished? But Wan Shutong was beyond caring about individual innocence. Humanity as a whole had failed the test. A few good scholars didn't outweigh the thousands who'd turned his gift into ammunition. By the time Team Avatar stumbled into the library during their search for information about the Fire Nation, it was already a shadow of its former self, half-buried, isolated, accessible only through a hidden tower rising from the desert sand. And Wan Shutong was bitter. Centuries of bitterness compressed into one very angry, very disillusioned owl spirit. When Sokka admitted they were using the library's knowledge to help with the war, even though they were fighting for peace, Wan Shutong had heard enough. He began sinking the library completely, choosing to bury all knowledge rather than watch humanity abuse it one more time. Could you blame him? He'd offered humanity the greatest gift imaginable, unrestricted access to the accumulated wisdom of civilizations, and they'd repaid him with war, betrayal, and the cynical weaponization of everything beautiful. But here's the tragedy within the tragedy. By hoarding knowledge, by deciding humans couldn't be trusted with information, Wan Shutong became exactly what he hated. Controlling, authoritarian, using power to enforce his worldview rather than trusting others to make their own choices. The library that once represented the free exchange of ideas became a prison of information, guarded by a spirit too hurt to remember why he'd built it in the first place. Somewhere beneath the Siwong Desert, that library still exists. Millions of scrolls, thousands of years of accumulated human achievement, locked away because humanity couldn't stop using knowledge to kill each other. It's a monument to both our greatest potential and our most consistent failure, the eternal gap between knowing better and actually doing better. And Wan Shutong remains there, alone with his 10,000 things, guarding them from the species that created them, convinced that isolation is wisdom, and that protecting knowledge from humanity is the same as protecting humanity from itself. Maybe he's right. Maybe we can't be trusted with unrestricted information. Maybe some knowledge should be locked away from people who'd weaponize anything, including wisdom. Or maybe, just maybe, the real lesson isn't about knowledge at all. It's about trust, about how easily hope can curdle into cynicism when you watch people consistently choose the worst version of themselves. Either way, the library's golden age is gone. The scholars have vanished. The spirit who once believed in humanity's potential now believes only in its inevitable corruption. And all that knowledge, all those thousands of years of discovery and insight sits buried in sand, preserved perfectly, accessible to no one, achieving nothing except proving that even spirits can have their hearts broken by disappointment. 10,000 things, he who knows. But apparently faith in humanity wasn't one of them. Before there was the Fire Nation, before there were Fire Lords and royal families and centuries of conquest dressed up as destiny, there were the Sun Warriors. They were the first. The original firebenders who didn't learn from military academies or aggressive masters demanding more power, more destruction, more dominance. They learned from dragons, actual, living, flying dragons who understood that fire wasn't a weapon. It was life itself, the sun rising each morning, the warmth that allowed crops to grow, the light that pushed back darkness. Fire was energy and passion, and the fundamental force that kept the world breathing. The Sun Warriors built a civilization around this philosophy. Their cities rose from jungle mountainsides, stone temples carved with dragon motifs, pyramids that caught the first light of dawn and seemed to glow from within. They studied the dancing dragon, the original firebending form passed down from Ran and Shaw, the two masters who embodied the sun's life-giving power. Every movement was poetry. Every flame was controlled, purposeful, beautiful. They didn't conquer. They didn't expand. They simply existed in harmony with fire, with nature, with the dragons who taught them that bending was about understanding, not dominating. And then everything changed. The exact timeline is fuzzy. History gets hazy when civilizations deliberately erase themselves, but somewhere along the way humanity's relationship with fire shifted. New firebenders emerged who saw the element differently, not as life, but as power, not as harmony, but as superiority. The dragon philosophy, patient, disciplined, focused on balance, got replaced by something more aggressive. Fire became a tool of war, and those who could wield it most destructively became leaders. This new philosophy spread, formed nations, created hierarchies. The Fire Nation rose from these ashes, pun absolutely intended, with a very different understanding of what fire meant. Strength through conquest, glory through domination. The sun wasn't a life-giver to be honoured, it was a symbol of supremacy to be claimed. The Sun Warriors watched this happen with growing horror. These weren't their teachings. The dancing dragon wasn't meant to burn villages and establish empires. Fire was supposed to bring warmth, not annihilation. But try explaining that to a military power convinced that might makes right, and that spreading their civilization was actually doing the world a favour. The dragons noticed too. And they started dying. Not from old age or natural causes, from hunting. Because somewhere in the Fire Nation's twisted evolution, dragon slaying became the ultimate test of a firebender's strength. Kill a dragon, absorb some mythical essence of power, earn glory and status. Never mind that dragons were the source of firebending knowledge. Never mind that they were ancient, wise, and had literally taught humanity how to bend. They were impressive trophies, and that was all that mattered. Sozin himself participated in this tradition. Iroh supposedly killed one before his spiritual transformation made him realise what he'd actually done. Dragon hunting became sport, entertainment, a rite of passage for ambitious firebenders looking to prove themselves. The Sun Warriors faced an impossible choice. Fight back, use their firebending to protect the dragons, which would mean embracing the violence they'd spent centuries rejecting, or hide, disappear so completely that the Fire Nation would forget they ever existed, taking their philosophy and their knowledge into self-imposed exile. They chose to hide. The entire civilization performed a vanishing act that would make the air nomads' isolation look half-hearted. They retreated deep into the rainforest, erected barriers both physical and spiritual, and became ghosts. The Fire Nation eventually declared them extinct. Easier to claim you're the pinnacle of firebending when the original masters are conveniently no longer around to point out that you fundamentally misunderstood everything. But the Sun Warriors survived. Barely. A shadow of what they'd been, clinging to traditions that the rest of the world had abandoned, protecting the last two dragons, Ran and Shaw, who represented the final living connection to firebending's true source. They stayed hidden for generations, watched as the Fire Nation waged war across the world, perverting fire into a tool of genocide and oppression. Watched as dragons went extinct, or so everyone believed. Stayed silent even as their philosophy could have maybe, possibly, offered an alternative to the destruction consuming the world. Why didn't they intervene? Why not reveal themselves, share the true meaning of firebending, try to course-correct the Fire Nation's trajectory? The Sun Warriors would probably say they'd learned that people choose what they want to hear. The Fire Nation wanted to believe in fire as power and dominance. Showing them a gentler way wouldn't change minds. It would just paint targets on Sun Warrior backs. Maybe that's wisdom. Maybe it's cowardice. Maybe it's both, tangled together like the vines reclaiming their ancient temples. Centuries passed. The 100-Year War raged, and the Sun Warriors remained hidden, performing the rituals, maintaining the temples, teaching their children the dancing dragon form, while the rest of the world learned firebending through aggression and conquest. Then one day, two idiots showed up. A scarred Fire Nation prince who'd lost his bending after choosing the wrong side, and a 12-year-old avatar who'd just realised that maybe his first firebending teacher, being an insane, abusive Fire Nation princess, wasn't the healthiest introduction to the element. Zuko and Aang stumbled into the Sun Warriors' territory looking for help, and the chief, wearing a headdress that hadn't changed design in probably 500 years, had a decision to make. Trust these outsiders with the secret of true firebending? Risk exposing Ran and Shaw to people who might not understand, might abuse the knowledge, might bring the Fire Nation's military down on their hidden paradise, or stay safe in isolation and let the world continue burning itself to ash with corrupted firebending philosophy? He chose to trust, to give these two kids a chance to meet the masters and learn what fire really meant. And Ran and Shaw, the last dragons, the final living repository of firebending wisdom, performed the dancing dragon with Zuko and Aang, showed them fire as rainbow light, as beauty, as life force and passion untainted by aggression. It changed everything. Zuko's firebending returned, but different. Not fueled by rage and desperation, but by understanding. Aang learned that fire didn't have to be the element of destruction that killed his people. It could be creation, warmth, the sun rising on a new day. The Sun Warriors' gamble paid off. Their philosophy, hidden for centuries, preserved through isolation and sacrifice, finally reached someone who could use it to heal rather than harm. But here's the question that haunts their story. What if they'd shared this knowledge earlier? What if instead of hiding, they'd fought to preserve their philosophy in the world? Could they have influenced the Fire Nation's development, offered an alternative vision before conquest became doctrine? We'll never know. The Sun Warriors chose preservation over influence, safety over risk, and you can't entirely blame them. Their civilization survived by becoming invisible. That's not nothing. They kept the dragons alive when the entire world wanted them dead. They maintained the true meaning of firebending when everyone else forgot it existed. But they also withdrew from a world that desperately needed their wisdom, choosing their own survival over the possibility of preventing centuries of war. It's the eternal dilemma of the righteous isolationist. If you have knowledge that could help but choose to keep it hidden, are you preserving wisdom or hoarding it? Are you protecting yourself or abandoning everyone else? The Sun Warriors would probably say they were doing what they had to do, that you can't force enlightenment on people committed to darkness, that sometimes survival is victory enough. And maybe they're right. They outlasted the Fire Nation's empire, kept the dragons breathing, preserved a form of firebending that the modern world had completely forgotten. When the moment finally came, when two lost souls needed guidance, the Sun Warriors were there, ready, unchanged by centuries of hiding. Their decline wasn't death, it was transformation. From a thriving civilization to a secret guardian order, protecting the ember of truth until someone worthy came looking for it. The world called them extinct. The Fire Nation moved on, convinced they'd surpassed their primitive ancestors, and deep in the jungle, The Sun Warriors performed the dancing dragon, taught their children to honour flames instead of weaponizing them, and waited. Sometimes disappearing isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the only way to ensure that when the world finally decides it's ready to learn, the teachers are still around to offer the lesson, even if it takes a century of war and 2 confused kids stumbling into your secret temple before that moment arrives. General Iroh, Dragon of the West, heir to the Fire Nation throne, led the siege of Ba Sing Se for 600 days. His forces surrounded the Earth Kingdom's impenetrable capital, slowly grinding down defences, preparing for the final assault that would cement his place in history as the greatest military commander the Fire Nation had ever produced. And then his son died. Lu Ten, young, brave, eager to make his father proud, fell in battle during one of the final pushes toward the inner wall. A random arrow, a moment of chaos, the absolute mundane cruelty of war reducing a beloved son to just another casualty statistic in a conflict that suddenly meant nothing. Iroh received the news in his command tent. By all accounts, he didn't rage or weep or destroy everything around him. He simply stopped, ordered the retreat, abandoned the siege his army had sacrificed 600 days to achieve. Walked away from glory, from destiny, from everything the Fire Nation valued, because none of it mattered anymore. His son was dead, and Iroh couldn't remember why conquering Ba Sing Se had ever seemed important. The Fire Nation called it weakness, called it failure. Azulon died shortly after, and Ozai seized the throne instead of waiting for his older brother to return and claim it. The whispers followed Iroh everywhere, broken, soft, unsuitable for leadership. The Dragon of the West had become the dragon who gave up. But here's what they didn't know. Iroh didn't give up. He went looking for something the Fire Nation had forgotten existed. Meaning beyond conquest. Purpose beyond power. A reason to keep breathing when everything you love turned to ash. He went to the spirit world. Not physically at first. The boundary between the physical and spiritual realms isn't a doorway you just walk through. It's a threshold that requires the right mindset, the right intention, the absolute dissolution of everything tying you to material existence. For most people, it's impossible. For a grieving father who'd lost the only thing that made him human. The barrier was paper thin. The journey began in forests near the Earth Kingdom, far from Fire Nation territory. Iroh wandered alone, no armor, no rank, just a broken man trying to understand why the universe would take his son and leave him alive. He meditated for days, weeks, let go of everything he'd been taught about strength and honor and Fire Nation superiority. And one morning, between sleeping and waking, he slipped through. The spirit world isn't like the physical realm. There's no consistent geography, no predictable physics, no rules that make sense to human logic. It's a place of emotion made manifest, where your intentions shape reality and spirits exist as pure expressions of natural forces. Joy can be a meadow of eternal sunrise. Rage can be a storm that never ends. Grief, the kind Iroh carried, becomes a fog that swallows everything, leaving you alone with memories that refuse to fade. Iroh wandered that grief fog for what felt like years. Time doesn't work the same in the spirit world. A minute can stretch into months, or decades can compress into heartbeats. He saw Lu Ten everywhere and nowhere, heard his son's voice calling from distances that never got closer no matter how far he walked. Some spirits ignored him. Others were curious about this Fire Nation general who'd invaded their realm not with violence but with sorrow. A few tried to help, though spirits don't understand human grief the way humans do. They offered cryptic wisdom, impossible riddles, observations that made perfect sense only after you'd spent months unravelling their meaning. One spirit, accounts differ on which one, maybe Ko the Face Stealer, maybe someone older and stranger, posed a question that shattered everything Iroh thought he understood. What are you without your son? Without your rank? Without your nation? What remains when you strip away everything you've defined yourself by? Iroh couldn't answer. Because the truth was terrifying. Nothing remained. He'd built his entire identity on being a general, a father, a Fire Nation prince. Take those away, and he was just empty. The spirit smiled. Good. Now you can begin learning who you actually are. That's when the real journey started. Iroh stopped searching for his son. stopped trying to reclaim what was lost, and started observing. He watched spirits of nature flowing through their cycles: birth, growth, decay, renewal. Nothing permanent, nothing lost, everything transforming into something else. He saw spirits of joy and sorrow existing side by side, neither conquering the other, both necessary for the world to function. He learned that fire wasn't just destruction, it was also warmth, light, transformation. The same flame that burned cities could bring families together on cold nights. The element he'd weaponized his entire life was actually something beautiful, and the Fire Nation had completely missed the point. He met the spirit of tea, and yes, there is a spirit of tea, because in the spirit world, anything humans care deeply about can manifest, and learned that sometimes wisdom tastes like jasmine, and sometimes healing comes from the simple ritual of boiling water and steeping leaves, and sharing a cup with someone who needs comfort more than answers. Time passed. Iroh grew softer, not weaker, softer. There's a difference the Fire Nation never understood. He learned to laugh again, not the diplomatic chuckle of a general, but the genuine belly laugh of someone who discovered that existence was fundamentally absurd and somehow that was okay. He learned to cry without shame. Learned that carrying grief didn't mean being consumed by it. And slowly, impossibly, he learned to forgive. Not the Earth Kingdom for killing his son. War doesn't work that way, and Lu Ten had been a soldier. He forgave himself for not being there, for leading the siege that put his son in danger, for valuing Fire Nation glory over his child's life until it was too late. The spirit world gave him something the physical world never could: perspective. From that realm, the 100-Year War looked small, pathetic even. Nations squabbling over territory while spirits embodying fundamental forces just existed, eternal and unconcerned with human power plays. When Iroh finally returned to the physical world, and he did learn to cross between worlds at will, one of maybe 3 humans in history to master that skill, he was fundamentally different. The broken general who'd entered had been destroyed completely. What emerged was something new. A man who valued tea over tactics, who'd choose protecting his nephew over reclaiming his throne, who understood that true strength meant building people up rather than tearing them down. The Fire Nation saw this transformation as weakness. Ozai dismissed him as irrelevant. Azula mocked his weight gain, and his obsession with Pai Sho and his irritating habit of offering wisdom instead of orders. They had no idea they were looking at someone who touched enlightenment and brought back the kind of power that military might couldn't touch. Iroh had learned to see spirits in the physical world, to cross between realms, to understand that balance, true cosmic balance, mattered more than any nation's temporary dominance. Years later, when a scarred prince needed guidance more than judgment, when a lost boy needed an uncle more than a taskmaster, Iroh was ready. Not because the spirit world had given him answers, but because it had taught him that the right questions mattered more than certainty. Did he ever see Lu Ten again? The show never says, but knowing Iroh, knowing the peace he carried despite his loss, maybe he did. Maybe during one of his many subsequent visits to the spirit world, maybe in dreams, maybe in that space between realms where the dead aren't quite gone and the living aren't quite alone. Or maybe he learned something harder, that love doesn't require presence. That you carry the people you've lost not as wounds but as parts of your soul, transformed through grief into something that makes you kinder, wiser, more capable of helping others through their own darkness. The Fire Nation lost a general when Iroh walked away from Ba Sing Se. The world gained a teacher who understood that sometimes the greatest journey isn't conquest. It's discovering that when everything is taken from you, you have the chance to build yourself into someone better than you were. Even if it takes crossing into the spirit world and wandering through grief until you find the person you were always meant to become. Someone who'd choose tea ceremonies over war rooms, who'd sacrifice everything for a nephew who wasn't even his son, who'd understand that true power isn't domination. It's knowing when to let go, how to transform pain into wisdom, and where to find the best jasmine leaves in the Earth Kingdom. Because sometimes the most important thing you bring back from the spirit world isn't mystical knowledge or cosmic insight. It's the simple understanding that a good cup of tea shared with someone you love is worth more than all the conquered cities in the world. And Iroh, the dragon of the West who'd walked through the spirit world and returned carrying love instead of ambition, spent the rest of his life proving it. 12 years old, blind since birth, daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the Earth Kingdom, expected to be delicate, helpless, a porcelain doll to be protected and pitied, and kept safely locked away from a world too dangerous for a girl who couldn't see. Toph Beifong had other plans. The Beifong estate was a prison disguised as luxury. High walls, manicured gardens, servants who spoke in hushed tones like volume might shatter their fragile young mistress. Her parents meant well, that's the tragedy of it. They genuinely believed they were protecting her, hired the finest tutors to teach her basic earthbending, just enough to navigate the estate safely. Nothing too strenuous, nothing that might tax her, certainly nothing dangerous. They had no idea their daughter was sneaking out every night and absolutely destroying grown men in underground fighting tournaments. It started with desperation. Toph's parents had hired Master Yu, a respected earthbending instructor who taught forms, discipline, and the absolute bare minimum required to not be completely useless. The lessons were painfully slow, insultingly simple. Stance work, breathing exercises, techniques designed for someone weak and incapable. Toph was neither of those things, but nobody bothered to notice. She'd discovered her real earthbending abilities years earlier, alone in the estate's underground tunnels where her parents thought she was safely contained. Down there in the darkness, where being blind meant absolutely nothing, she'd encountered badger moles, the original earthbenders who taught humans the art millennia ago. They couldn't see either. They navigated through seismic sense, feeling vibrations through the earth, experiencing the world as movement and pressure, and the tiniest shifts in the ground beneath their paws. To them, Toph wasn't disabled. She was like them, and they taught her their way, not the rigid, formal earthbending of human masters, but something primal, direct, powerful. Toph learned to see through earth-bending. Every footstep, every heartbeat, every blade of grass moving in the wind, all of it transmitted through the ground in waves she could read like others read text. Being blind stopped mattering. She could see better than anyone with working eyes, because her perception had no blind spots, no limits of distance, no way to be fooled by appearances. And once she realized how strong she actually was, the Beifong estate became unbearable. So she left. Not permanently, that would come later, but in stolen moments. Late nights when her parents thought she was sleeping, Toph would slip through the walls. Earthbending makes excellent doorways when you don't care about architectural permanence, and head to the one place where someone might actually appreciate her abilities, the underground earthbending arena. Earthrumble was barely legal, and absolutely brutal. Fighters from across the Earth Kingdom competed for prize money, glory, and the chance to prove they were the toughest earthbender alive. The rules were simple. 2 fighters enter the ring, earthbending only, last one standing wins. No holds barred, no mercy, no complaints. The first time Toph showed up, the organisers laughed. This tiny blind girl wanted to fight? Against men twice her size with decades of training? It was absurd, cruel even, to let her enter. She paid the entry fee and waited for someone to take the bait. Her first opponent probably expected an easy win. Quick match, collect the victory, maybe go gentle on the kid so she didn't get hurt too badly. He was a decent earthbender, solid stance, good form, nothing fancy but technically sound. Toph demolished him in under 30 seconds. She didn't use Master Yu's careful techniques or the formal earthbending styles taught in academies. She fought like a badger mole, raw, instinctive, reading her opponent's movements through the ground and responding before they'd even committed to an attack. She felt him shift his weight, knew he was going to throw a boulder, and had already launched him out of the ring before his rock finished forming. The crowd went silent, then absolutely erupted. Nobody knew who this kid was. Nobody had ever seen earthbending that direct, that efficient, that completely unconcerned with looking impressive. She just won. Decisively, overwhelmingly, making experienced fighters look like children playing with mud. They called her the Blind Bandit, partly because of the obvious, the lack of sight that somehow made her more dangerous, not less, but also because she was robbing people blind, taking their money and their dignity and walking away like it was nothing. Toph entered tournament after tournament, built a reputation, became the champion, defending her title against challengers who thought surely this time they'd figure out her weakness. They never did, because she didn't have one. Her blindness wasn't a weakness, it was her greatest strength. She experienced earthbending in a way sighted people couldn't, feeling the element's true nature rather than imposing human expectations on it. The prize money piled up. Toph couldn't exactly bring it home. Explaining to her parents where a 12-year-old blind girl acquired a fortune would raise uncomfortable questions, so she stashed it. Kept a small amount for expenses. You can't earthbend your way into paying for street food, unfortunately, and saved the rest for a future where she wouldn't need the Beifong name to survive. But the real prize wasn't money, it was freedom. For a few hours each week, Toph got to be herself. Not the helpless girl her parents pitied, not the tragic victim of blindness that polite society whispered about. Just the greatest earthbender alive, doing what she was born to do and absolutely loving every second of it. The double life was exhausting. Days spent pretending to be weak, accepting Master Yu's patronizing lessons, playing the role of the fragile Beifong daughter. Nights spent being the blind bandit, facing challengers who wanted to dethrone her, defending her title through pure skill and the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you're untouchable. Her parents never suspected. Why would they? Their daughter could barely navigate the estate. She needed help with stairs. She certainly wasn't sneaking out to participate in underground fighting tournaments. The possibility wouldn't even occur to them, and Toph let them believe it. Because the alternative, revealing her abilities, admitting she'd been lying for years, forcing her parents to confront that their protective instincts were actually suffocating her, felt harder than just maintaining the charade. Until one day, a bald kid with arrows on his head and the worst earthbending she'd ever witnessed crashed her tournament, challenged her to a fight, and somehow saw through the entire carefully constructed double life she'd built. But that's a different story. The years before Aang, those were Toph's golden age. When she was the undefeated champion, the mysterious blind bandit, the earthbender who'd revolutionized fighting styles without anyone knowing her real name or where she came from. She was 12 years old, blind, and the most dangerous earthbender in the entire Earth Kingdom. And the only people who knew were the fighters she'd humiliated and the crowds who chanted her name while her parents slept peacefully, convinced their fragile daughter was safely tucked in bed. Sometimes the greatest freedom isn't escaping your prison. It's discovering that the walls were never as solid as they looked, and you had the power to walk through them the entire time. Toph figured that out earlier than most, and while she eventually left the Beifong estate for good, those early tournaments, those nights of being truly completely herself, taught her the most important lesson she'd ever learn. Nobody gets to define your limits except you. Not your parents, not your disability, not society's expectations, just you. And if people underestimate you because they can't see past what you're missing, well, that just makes it more satisfying when you prove them catastrophically wrong. The blind bandit didn't lose. Not once, not ever. And when she finally joined Team Avatar, traded tournament fighting for actual world saving, she brought that same energy. Unstoppable, unapologetic, and absolutely done with people telling her what she couldn't do. Because she'd already spent years proving them wrong every single night. One demolished opponent at a time. 7 years old, blue flames already dancing at her fingertips, a feat most firebenders don't achieve until adulthood, if ever. Perfect form, perfect control, perfect everything. Standing in the Fire Nation Palace courtyard while her father watched with something that might have been pride, if Ozai were capable of feeling anything that human. Azula didn't smile because she was happy. She smiled because she'd learned that perfection earned approval, and approval was the closest thing to love she was going to get. This is where it started. Not with cruelty or malice, but with a little girl desperately trying to earn affection in a family where love was transactional and failure meant invisibility. The Fire Nation royal family was a pressure cooker disguised as a palace. Ozai, second son, overlooked his entire life, burning with resentment that his older brother Iroh was the favoured heir. Ursa, a woman who'd been essentially kidnapped into an arranged marriage, trapped in a gilded cage with a husband who saw her as a possession. Zuko, the oldest child trying so hard to be good enough and consistently falling short, and Azula, born with terrifying natural talent and a front row seat to the most dysfunctional family dynamic imaginable. From the beginning, Azula understood the game. Ozai valued power, strength, results. He didn't care about his children as people. They were extensions of his ambition, tools to prove his superiority. Zuko kept trying to earn their father's love through effort and dedication. Azula took a different approach. She'd simply be so exceptional that love became irrelevant. Who needs affection when you have dominance? Her firebending manifested early and aggressively. While other children were learning basic forms, Azula was generating flames. While Zuko struggled with his katas, Azula perfected them on the first try. She didn't just learn, she dominated every lesson, every training session, every opportunity to prove she was better. And Ozai noticed. Finally someone saw her. Not Ursa, who looked at her daughter with something that might have been concern or fear or sadness. Azula couldn't tell and stopped trying to interpret it. But Ozai. He watched her like a craftsman admiring his finest creation. That attention became everything. Every perfect technique earned a nod. Every display of ruthlessness earned a smile. Slowly, methodically, Ozai shaped his daughter into a weapon, and Azula let him, because being his favourite felt better than being nobody's anything. Her mother tried. Ursa would pull Azula aside, attempt conversations about feelings and kindness, and the importance of compassion. But to a child desperately seeking approval from a father who valued none of those things, her mother's gentle words felt like criticism, like disappointment, like Azula was somehow failing by being exactly what she'd been taught to be. The relationship fractured early. Ursa favoured Zuko, or at least that's how Azula interpreted it. In reality, Ursa was probably just trying to protect her son from Ozai's cruelty, offering him the emotional support he needed to survive their father's contempt. But to Azula, it looked like her mother loved the failure and rejected the success. Proof that kindness was weakness, that love was for people who couldn't earn respect through power. There was a moment, accounts vary but the story persists, where young Azula discovered something devastating. Maybe she overheard a conversation. Maybe she noticed the way her mother looked at her with fear instead of warmth. But somehow, Azula learned that Ursa was afraid of her. Not proud, not loving, afraid. That knowledge did something permanent to a 7-year-old's psyche. If your own mother fears you, what does that make you? Monster, weapon, something broken that can never be fixed. Azula chose a fourth option. Make fear your advantage. If people were going to be afraid anyway, better to lean into it, better to be terrifying on purpose than accidentally. She started experimenting with cruelty. Small things at first, comments designed to hurt, manipulations to test her power over others, little demonstrations that she could make people flinch. Each successful hurt was data, evidence that emotions were weaknesses to exploit, that caring about people gave them power over you. Zuko became her favourite target. Her older brother, clumsy and earnest and trying so desperately to be good, he was perfect practice. Azula learned to read him, to find exactly what would wound deepest, to deliver cutting observations disguised as sibling banter. And Zuko, because he loved his sister and kept hoping she'd love him back, never quite learned to defend himself. Their childhood games turned vicious. Not on Zuko's end. He was playing. But Azula was training. Every game of hide-and-seek was reconnaissance. Every sparring match was a lesson in exploitation. She learned where his weaknesses were, physically and emotionally, mapping her brother's vulnerabilities like a general studying enemy territory. Ozai encouraged this, praised Azula for her strategic thinking, mocked Zuko for being soft, created an environment where sibling rivalry became blood sport, and the winner earned scraps of paternal approval while the loser got contempt. The blue flames appeared around her 8th birthday. Most firebenders produce orange or red flames, the natural colours of combustion. But Azula's fire burned hotter, concentrated enough to achieve blue coloration. It was a genetic anomaly, a marker of exceptional power and control. Ozai called her a prodigy. Azula called it proof that she was special, different, better than everyone else, including her failure of a brother. The blue flames became her signature. Beautiful, dangerous, and fundamentally other than normal fire. But here's what nobody talks about. Those blue flames required constant, exhausting control. One moment of distraction, one slip in focus, and they'd flicker back to ordinary orange. Maintaining that perfection was draining, but Azula couldn't let them falter because the blue flames were proof of her superiority. Letting them fail meant admitting she was ordinary, so she never relaxed, never let her guard down, never allowed herself a moment of imperfection, because imperfection meant losing the only source of validation she had. Her childhood friendships, if you can call them that, were equally calculated. Mai and Ty Lee orbited her not out of affection, but because Azula had mastered social manipulation by age 9. She knew Mai responded to confidence and decisiveness. She knew Ty Lee craved attention and approval. She gave them both exactly enough of what they needed to keep them loyal, while never giving away anything real about herself. Because that was the lesson Azula had absorbed. Vulnerability is weakness. Caring about people gives them power over you. Love is a weapon people use to hurt you. Better to be the one wielding it than the one bleeding from it. The cracks were there from the beginning, if anyone had looked. The way Azula's smile never reached her eyes. The perfectionism that bordered on obsessive. The inability to accept any failure, no matter how minor. The growing paranoia that everyone was judging her, testing her, waiting for her to slip so they could declare her unworthy. But nobody looked. Ozai saw a weapon functioning exactly as designed. Ursa saw a daughter slipping away and had no idea how to reach her. Zuko saw his sister and had no framework for understanding that bullies are often victims who learn to strike first. By the time Azula was a teenager, confident, calculating, terrifyingly competent, the damage was complete. She'd been raised in an environment where love was conditional, where failure meant abandonment, where the only way to survive was to be perfect every single moment of every single day. She'd won her father's approval, become the prodigy everyone whispered about, mastered firebending, strategy, manipulation, and the art of making people fear her enough to never risk getting close. And she'd lost everything that makes a person human in the process. The ability to trust, to be vulnerable, to believe that people might care about her for reasons beyond usefulness, to understand that failure doesn't equal worthlessness, that mistakes don't define you, that being loved shouldn't require perfection. Azula's childhood wasn't a tragedy of abuse. It was a tragedy of conditional love and impossible standards. She wasn't broken by cruelty. She was broken by being taught that excellence was the only currency that mattered, and then discovering that no amount of excellence would ever be enough to fill the hole where unconditional love should have been. The prodigy who could generate blue flames and defeat opponents twice her age was really just a little girl who learned too early that caring about people was dangerous, that showing weakness meant abandonment, and that the only way to survive was to become so perfect, so powerful, so terrifying that nobody could ever hurt her again. She succeeded, became exactly what her father wanted, and spent the rest of her life discovering that winning a game nobody should have been playing is the loneliest victory imaginable. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to a child isn't abuse. It's teaching them that love has to be earned, that affection is a reward for perfection, and that the only way to matter is to never, ever be human enough to fail. Azula learned that lesson at 7 years old, with blue flames dancing on her fingertips and her father finally looking at her with something other than indifference. And by the time she realised the cost, it was far too late to unlearn it. 12 years old. Told you're the Avatar 4 years early because the world can't wait for tradition when war is knocking on every door. Expected to master 3 additional elements, achieve spiritual enlightenment, and somehow save civilization before you're old enough to understand what any of that actually means. Aang didn't ask for this, and the 3 years between discovering his identity and running away into that storm weren't a training montage set to inspirational music. They were slow-motion suffocation disguised as destiny. Before the reveal, life was simple. Wake up at dawn for meditation, practice airbending forms with the other kids, play airball until sunset, sneak extra fruit pies from the kitchens with Gyatso, laugh until your sides hurt. Fall asleep surrounded by friends who saw you as just another airbender, not the bridge between worlds or the last hope for peace. Then the monk sat him down, showed him the 4 toys he'd chosen as a toddler, relics from past avatars that supposedly proved his identity, and explained that everything was about to change. Aang didn't believe them at first. The avatar? Him? The kid who'd rather play games than meditate properly? Who couldn't sit still during philosophy lessons? Who'd rather race through temple corridors on air scooters than study ancient texts? There had to be a mistake. There wasn't. The avatar state flickered in his eyes during moments of strong emotion, confirming what the monks already knew. Aang was the avatar. The previous life cycle had ended, and Rava's spirit had chosen him for reasons nobody could explain but everyone had to accept. The training began immediately, and it was nothing like the peaceful airbending lessons he'd grown up with. The monks became serious, urgent, pushing him harder than they'd ever pushed anyone. Master waterbending forms even though he'd never seen an ocean. Study earthbending philosophy despite having no earth to practice with. Memorize firebending histories from scrolls because they couldn't exactly invite Fire Nation teachers to the Southern Air Temple during a military build-up. Aang tried. He really did. Threw himself into the training because that's what avatars were supposed to do. But the more he learned, the more impossible it all seemed. 3 additional elements to master. Political conflicts he didn't understand. Spiritual responsibilities that required letting go of attachments, including the people he loved most. And the isolation. That was the worst part. His friends started treating him differently the moment they learned he was the avatar. The easy camaraderie vanished, replaced by formality and distance. Kids who used to tackle him during airball matches now hesitated, like accidentally knocking over the avatar might trigger some cosmic catastrophe. Jokes fell flat. Invitations to games stopped coming. Even the kids who tried to act normal couldn't hide the awkwardness. Aang went from being everyone's friend to being everyone's responsibility. Gyatso did his best to maintain normalcy. Still snuck desserts, still played Pai Sho, still treated Aang like a kid who needed guidance and laughter rather than a vessel for cosmic power. But even Gyatso couldn't protect him from the other monks' increasingly urgent demands. The world was fracturing. Firelord Sozin was mobilizing armies, making speeches about sharing Fire Nation prosperity with less civilized nations, propaganda for imperialism dressed in benevolence. The air nomads, pacifists to their core, had no military response. Their only hope was the avatar mastering all 4 elements and somehow balancing a situation that was rapidly spiraling toward open war. No pressure, 12-year-old boy who just wanted to play with his friends. Aang's training sessions grew longer, more intense. He'd practice waterbending forms in empty courtyards, moving through the motions without actually having water to bend, feeling ridiculous and frustrated. He'd meditate for hours trying to connect with past avatars, spiritual masters who'd supposedly guide him. But mostly, he just sat there with his thoughts spiraling into anxiety. The worst sessions were the ones where elder monks explained his future. He'd need to leave soon, travel to the water tribes to learn waterbending properly. Then the Earth Kingdom for years of earthbending training. Then, and this was delivered with careful neutrality, the Fire Nation, despite their concerning military expansion. Each element would take years to master. He'd be away from home until he was well into adulthood, if he survived the training at all. Oh, and the Fire Nation might declare war any day now, so best to master everything quickly, just in case. Aang was 12. The monks were asking him to leave everything he knew, master impossible skills, navigate political situations that terrified adults, and somehow save the world before it tore itself apart. And they were annoyed he wasn't progressing faster. The nightmares started around year 2. Visions of fire consuming the temples. Friends dying while he stood paralyzed, unable to help. The avatar state activating and destroying everything around him. The people he loved caught in cosmic power he couldn't control. He'd wake up gasping, airbending instinctively defensive gusts that rattled his room. Gyatso would find him afterward, make tea, talk about nothing important until Aang's breathing steadied. Never offered empty reassurances like, "You'll be fine," or "It's just a dream." Just sat with him, present and solid, a reminder that not everything had to be about destiny and duty. But even Gyatso couldn't shield him from the council's decision. Year 3, they declared Aang needed to leave immediately. No more waiting for him to turn 16. No more gentle preparation. The Fire Nation was moving. War was imminent, and the Avatar needed to be ready now. They'd send him to the Eastern Air Temple, separate him from Gyatso, the only person who still treated him like a person instead of a cosmic necessity. Train him properly, without the indulgent emotional attachments that were clearly interfering with his development. Aang overheard the conversation, heard the monks say Gyatso's love for him was a problem, heard them decide to take away the one good thing left in his increasingly suffocating life. That night, he ran, grabbed Appa, flew into a storm without thinking, got knocked into the ocean, and instinctively entered the Avatar state to create an ice sphere that preserved them both for 100 years while the world burned without him. But those 3 years before, those years of training and pressure and slowly losing everything that made him happy, that's where Aang learned the most important lesson of his entire life. Being the Avatar wasn't about power or destiny or cosmic responsibility. It was about impossible choices, crushing loneliness, and the constant weight of everyone's expectations trying to reshape you into something they needed, rather than allowing you to be who you were. When Aang woke up a century later, still 12, still scared, still just a kid who wanted his friends back, he'd missed the war he was supposed to prevent, failed completely by every objective measure, and maybe that failure saved him, because those 3 years of training had been slowly crushing the joy out of him, turning an air nomad who loved life into a weapon pointed at problems he didn't understand. The iceberg gave him a century to reset. When he emerged, the world needed saving more than ever, but this time, Aang would do it his way, with friends, with laughter, with the understanding that being the Avatar didn't mean sacrificing everything that made life worth living. Those 3 years taught him what he didn't want to be. The next 9 months would teach him what he could be instead. Powerful and playful, responsible and ridiculous, the Avatar and just Aang, all tangled together in a way the monks never imagined was possible. Sometimes the worst training is the kind that teaches you exactly what you need to unlearn. Avatar Kyoshi was 7 feet tall, wore full kabuki makeup that could stop a grown man's heart, and once murdered a tyrant by splitting an entire peninsula from the mainland and letting him fall to his death. She didn't believe in half measures, and she definitely didn't believe that women needed men to protect them. This was 400 years before Aang woke up in an iceberg, when the Earth Kingdom was even more of a chaotic mess than usual. Warlords carved up territories like they were serving dinner. Villages paid tribute to whichever bandit had the biggest army that week. Women were expected to stay home, stay quiet, and definitely stay out of combat. Kyoshi looked at this situation and decided, absolutely not. Her own story was complicated. Raised by outlaws, trained by assassins, discovered she was the Avatar way later than normal because the previous Avatar Kuruk had died young, and everyone miscalculated the cycle. By the time she fully embraced her role, she'd already learned that the world didn't care about fairness, it cared about power, and if you wanted to protect people, really protect them, you needed to be willing to get your hands dirty. So when her home village on Kyoshi Island faced threats from raiders and warlords, she didn't just drive them off, she split the entire peninsula from the mainland, creating an island that was geographically separate from the Earth Kingdom's chaos. A fresh start, a place where different rules could apply. But geography wasn't enough. Islands can be invaded, isolation can be broken. Kyoshi needed something more permanent, a legacy that would outlast her. That's when she founded the Warriors. The concept was revolutionary for the era, an all-female fighting force, trained in combat techniques that Kyoshi herself developed by combining earth-bending principles with hand-to-hand combat. The fans weren't decorative, they were weapons, metal edges hidden in silk capable of blocking blades or slicing through defences, lightweight, elegant and absolutely lethal in trained hands. But here's the thing about the Kyoshi warriors that made them different from every other fighting force. The makeup wasn't war paint, it was armour. When you paint your face like Avatar Kyoshi, white foundation, dramatic red and black accents, lips painted in her signature style, you're not just honouring her memory. You're erasing yourself, becoming part of something larger. The makeup transforms individual warriors into a unified force, each face identical, each person subsuming their identity into the collective legacy. It's terrifying to opponents. You're not fighting individual women, you're fighting Kyoshi herself, multiplied. and it's empowering to the warriors. Your doubts, your fears, your individual weaknesses, they disappear under the makeup. You become the legend. You carry 400 years of unbroken tradition, and that weight makes you stronger, not weaker. Kyoshi trained the first generation herself, taught them that fighting wasn't about size or brute strength. It was about precision, strategy, reading your opponent's weaknesses and exploiting them before they realized they'd lost. She incorporated earth-bending philosophy without the actual bending. Be unmovable when you need to be. Strike decisively when the moment comes, and never ever apologize for taking up space in a world that wants you small. The fans became symbolic of this philosophy. Delicate appearance, deadly reality, easily underestimated, impossible to ignore once you understood what they could do. Women in a world that dismissed them, warriors in a society that said they should be victims, and the tradition held. For 4 centuries the Kyoshi warriors maintained their island, trained each generation in the same techniques, wore the same makeup, carried the same fans. They remained neutral in most conflicts. Kyoshi Island wasn't part of the Earth Kingdom's military structure. But they defended their home with a ferocity that made even Fire Nation commanders think twice about invasion. When Sokka first encountered them, he got his entire worldview demolished in about 30 seconds. These girls he'd assumed needed protecting proceeded to kick his overconfident butt so thoroughly that he had to completely reassess everything he'd been taught about gender and combat. And then, in what might be the most beautiful part of their legacy, they let him join, taught him their techniques, dressed him in their armour and makeup. Because the Kyoshi warriors weren't about exclusion. They were about proving that strength doesn't require testosterone, that warriors can wear makeup and dresses and still demolish opponents, and that the best way to honour a legacy is to share it with anyone willing to uphold its values. Suki, their leader during the 100-Year War, embodied everything Kyoshi had built. Fierce, strategic, absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting her people. She led her warriors beyond their island to fight in the war, breaking centuries of neutrality because sometimes staying safe means letting others suffer, and that wasn't what Kyoshi would have wanted. 400 years after Avatar Kyoshi painted her face and picked up her fans, her warriors were still fighting, still protecting, still proving that the greatest legacy isn't monuments or statues. It's people who carry your values forward, adapting to new challenges while maintaining the core of what made you matter. Kyoshi created more than a fighting force. She created a philosophy that women don't need permission to be dangerous, that tradition can be radical, and that the best revenge against a world that wants you invisible is to paint your face like a legend and dare anyone to ignore you. The fans still spin, the makeup still transforms, and somewhere in the spirit world a 7-foot-tall avatar probably smiles every time another generation of warriors proves that 400 years isn't nearly long enough to diminish a legacy built on being absolutely, unapologetically unstoppable. Lieutenant G didn't ask for this assignment. Nobody on that ship did. Babysitting a disgraced 13-year-old prince on an impossible mission to capture a mythical figure who'd been dead for a century. That wasn't a deployment, it was exile by proxy. The crew of Zuko's ship were the Fire Nation's cast-offs, soldiers who'd disappointed commanders, sailors who'd questioned orders, engineers who'd been too competent for their own good, and made their superiors look bad. They were sent to Zuko's vessel as punishment, expected to waste years sailing in circles while the real war happened without them. What they didn't expect was to actually care about the angry kid who commanded them. The early days were brutal. Zuko was 13, traumatized, furious at the world, and absolutely convinced that finding the Avatar was the only path back to his father's love. He drove the crew relentlessly. Impossible schedules, dangerous pursuits, screaming orders at men twice his age who'd forgotten more about naval operations than he'd ever learned. Lieutenant G considered mutiny more than once. Not violently, just dropping the prince off somewhere, reporting the ship lost and disappearing into the Earth Kingdom to live out the war in peace. The crew would have supported him. They were tired, underpaid, and following a banished prince who treated them like obstacles rather than people. Then came the storm. They were pursuing the Avatar, again, and Zuko ordered them to sail straight into a typhoon. Suicidal, insane. G confronted him, demanded to know what they were dying for, and Iroh intervened with a story that changed everything. He told them about the Agni Kai, about Ozai burning his own son's face for speaking out of turn, about a 13-year-old boy begging for mercy while his father scarred him and banished him for showing compassion. The crew went silent. They'd all assumed Zuko earned his exile through incompetence or cowardice. That's what banishment usually meant. Learning the truth, that this kid had been brutalized for showing honor, reframed everything. G called off the mutiny. Not because the mission became less impossible, but because suddenly they weren't following a spoiled prince. They were protecting a traumatized kid who had no one except his uncle, and a ship full of soldiers who'd been as abandoned by the Fire Nation as he was. The dynamic shifted. Slowly, carefully, the crew started supporting Zuko instead of just obeying him. When he pushed too hard, they'd gently redirect. When he spiraled into self-loathing after another failed avatar hunt, they'd maintain the ship and give him space to recover. When supplies ran low, they'd stretch rations so Zuko and Iroh never went without, even if the crew went hungry. And Uncle Iroh became the ship's unofficial morale officer. He'd play Paisho with the soldiers, share tea, tell stories about his own days as a commander, and offer wisdom that had nothing to do with capturing the Avatar and everything to do with being human in a dehumanizing war. The crew learned Zuko's tells. When he was spiraling, when he needed to be alone, when he actually wanted company but wouldn't admit it. They watched him train obsessively, pushing his firebending past reasonable limits, and understood that every perfect form was him trying to prove he deserved to exist. They became protective. When other Fire Nation ships mocked the banished prince, G's crew would get dangerously quiet. When port authorities dismissed Zuko as irrelevant, the crew made sure their ship left those ports with mysteriously damaged supply lines. Small rebellions, insignificant in the grand scheme, but meaningful to a kid who'd been told he was worthless. Years passed. The crew sailed across the world, pursuing the Avatar who turned out to be very real and very good at escaping. They weathered storms, battles, diplomatic disasters, and Zuko's teenage angst. Through it all, they became something unexpected. A family. Not a healthy one. Families built on shared trauma rarely are. But a real one. Soldiers who'd been cast aside by the Fire Nation, finding purpose in protecting one boy who'd been cast aside even more brutally. Then everything changed. Zuko captured the Avatar in Ba Sing Se, earned back his honor, returned to the Fire Nation as a prince, and the crew got reassigned. Scattered to different vessels, different units, their shared missions suddenly over. G tried to celebrate. They'd succeeded. The banished prince was banished no more. But walking off that ship for the last time felt wrong, like abandoning someone who still needed them, even if he didn't realize it yet. What happened to them after? The show never says. They disappear from the narrative once Zuko returns home, their purpose fulfilled, their story deemed unimportant. But here's what we can imagine. G probably got a decent assignment. He'd technically succeeded in his mission, even if it had nothing to do with his competence, and everything to do with Azula's schemes. The other crew members likely returned to normal military service, carrying stories about the banished prince that nobody quite believed. Did they hear about Zuko's betrayal? His decision to abandon his restored honor and join the Avatar? Did they understand why? Or did it feel like their years of loyalty had been wasted on someone who'd throw it all away for the enemy? Maybe some understood. Maybe they remembered the boy who'd spoken against a cruel plan and been burned for it. Maybe they realized that Zuko choosing the Avatar over his father was exactly the kind of honor they'd always known he possessed. Or maybe they felt betrayed, used, like they'd wasted 3 years of their lives on a prince who'd ultimately chosen the losing side. The truth is probably messier than either option. Soldiers rarely get clean narratives. They did their duty, formed unexpected bonds, and then got scattered back into the war machine that never cared about individuals. But for 3 years, that crew gave a traumatized teenager something he desperately needed. Adults who saw him as a person worth protecting, even when he couldn't protect himself. They were forgotten by history, unnamed in most episodes, irrelevant to the grand narrative of the Avatar saving the world. Yet without them, Zuko might not have survived long enough to become the man who'd eventually help end the war. Every meal they prepared, every course correction they made, every moment they chose to support rather than abandon him, Those small acts kept him alive long enough to matter. Lieutenant G and his crew were footnotes in a legend. But every story needs footnotes. Sometimes the people history forgets were the ones holding everything together while the heroes figured out how to save the world. And somewhere in the Fire Nation, a lieutenant probably still wonders about the scarred prince he once sailed with, hoping the kid he helped protect became the man he always had the potential to be, even if nobody remembers they were there to witness it. If the spirit world had windows, the oases would be the places where the glass gets thinnest. Start with the one everyone knows, the Northern Water Tribe's Spirit Oasis. Hidden behind layers of ice and stone, in a secret garden warmed by a spring that never freezes, sits a small pool fed by water that glows softer than moonlight. 2 koi fish circle endlessly, one black with a white spot, one white with a black spot, embodying Tui and La, the ocean and the moon, the living spirits that literally keep the tides moving and the waterbenders bending. This isn't just a pretty pond, it's a heartbeat. Take one spirit out of balance, and the entire world convulses in response. What makes these places different isn't just spiritual energy, it's overlap. Spirit oases sit where the fabric between worlds is worn thin, where physical reality and spiritual presence share the same coordinates. In the north, that means a garden where snow refuses to fall, plants stay green year-round, and the water feels aware. It responds more quickly to bending, carries visions in its reflections, and allows the avatar to slip more easily between worlds because the boundary is already blurred. Stand there long enough, and you don't just feel calm, you feel seen. But the north isn't unique, it's just the best maintained. You can see echoes of spirit oases elsewhere. The swamp's banyan grove tree functions like a horizontal oasis, its roots touching minds and memories across vast distances, turning muddy floodwater into a spiritual network. Old air nomad meditation sites, cliffside shrines, high mountaintop caves often sit on subtle spiritual hotspots, places where even a non-bender might feel lighter, like gravity forgot to hold quite as tight. And around ancient Fire Nation volcanoes, there are spots where the heat feels less like temperature and more like presence, where the fire in the earth seems to be listening. What ties all these places together is this: they are invitations. Not fortresses, not weapons, not resources to exploit. Invitations for humans to remember they are not the centre of the universe, just one part of a larger, stranger ecosystem that includes spirits, elements, and forces that don't care about national borders. The tragedy is that most of the world either forgot these doorways or tried to own them. The North turned its oasis into a guarded secret. The Fire Nation, at its worst, would have harnessed such a place, bottled it, turned it into fuel. Only a few, past avatars, wise sages, the occasional wandering lunatic with too much time and too much curiosity, treated these oases as they truly are, places to listen, not to demand. If you stood at the edge of one tonight, no war, no looming comet, no desperate plan, what would you ask? Or would you let the silence ask its questions of you instead? Bussing Sea wasn't built for equality. It was built for control. The crown gleamed from the inner wall, where Daily agents whispered in marble corridors and the Earth King hosted banquets that could feed entire villages. Beyond the Middle Ring's merchants and scholars lay the Lower Ring, a sprawling maze of crumbling tenements, polluted canals and shanties where millions scraped by on dreams that never materialized. This was where the war refugees washed up, where Earth Kingdom citizens fled Fire Nation invasions only to find a different kind of occupation. Life here moved at survival speed. Street vendors hawked questionable meat skewers while pickpockets worked the crowds. Laundry hung from every window, flapping like defeated flags. The air smelled of coal smoke, sewage, and desperation cooked into every brick. Factories churned out weapons for a war nobody talked about, employing children whose parents had vanished into refugee lines or Daily prisons. Water came from communal pumps that often ran dry. Food meant standing in lines that snaked around blocks for rice rations doled out by board officials. The Daily's surveillance was omnipresent but subtle. Brainwashed informants blended into markets, reporting disloyal conversations, anything that questioned the war, the king, or the city's impenetrable walls. Curfews hit hardest here, where night markets were the only economy that worked. Disappearances happened quietly. A neighbour who spoke too loudly about Fire Nation atrocities, gone by morning, family told he relocated for work. The lower ring learned fast to keep heads down, smiles practiced, opinions buried. Refugees carried stories that curdled in the telling. Southern Water Tribe families who lost villagers to Fire Nation raids, now crammed into single rooms, their waterbending suppressed by fear of exposure. Earth Kingdom farmers whose fields burned, reduced to factory shifts that mangled hands and lungs. No glory, no heroism, just the slow erosion of identity under bureaucracy's weight. Judy, the tour guide avatar, smiled through it all. Bussing Say is the safest city in the world. Nothing bad ever happens here. Yet resistance flickered in shadows. Underground networks smuggled messages from the resistance. Black market healers treated Daily torture victims. Children played games mimicking Appa flights, whispering about the avatar like a prayer. Jin, the girl who crushed on Jet before his rage turned toxic, represented the lower ring's fragile hope. Ordinary people clinging to normalcy amid engineered oblivion. Most never reached the upper ring. The promise of prosperity was a lie for control, walls within walls ensuring the powerful stayed insulated, while the lower ring bore the war's unseen cost. They weren't soldiers or heroes, just people who kept the city running while forgetting how to dream beyond ration lines. What does it say about a great civilization when its foundation is built on people too broken to revolt, too hopeful to despair completely? Basingsi endured because the lower ring endured, invisible and unbreakable in their quiet persistence. Ember Island wasn't always a playground for Fire Nation elites. Before the war turned it into vacation villas and beach parties for the powerful, it was something quieter, simpler, a place where the royal family could pretend they were ordinary. The beaches stretched golden under a relentless sun, waves crashing with the kind of rhythm that made worries dissolve. Palm trees swayed lazy arcs, and tide pools glittered with life too small to matter. No palaces here, just sprawling estates blending into cliffsides, designed to catch breezes and sunset views. The air smelled of salt and flowers and possibility, the kind that made even royals feel small. For the young royal family, these summers were escape. Ozai, still crown prince then, not yet consumed by ambition, would chase waves with his children. Ursa orchestrated picnics under palm shade, her laughter genuine before palace intrigue hardened her edges. Zuko built sand forts that never quite matched his sister's perfect replicas. Azula orchestrated games where victory was inevitable, but even she softened here, blue flames forgotten for seashell hunts and tide pool explorations. Ursa's memories anchored the island's magic. She'd wander hidden coves alone, sketching shells or watching dolphins arc through surf. Moments of peace snatched from a life of duty. Here, away from court politics and Ozai's growing intensity, she'd teach Zuko to swim, braid Azula's hair with hibiscus, whisper stories of simpler worlds. The estate's veranda held family dinners where conversations flowed without agendas, fireflies dancing like living lanterns. But war's shadow crept in slowly. Sozin's plans filtered through even paradise. Ozai's late-night scrolls, Ursa's worried glances at horizon ships. The children sensed it. Games turning competitive, laughter sharpening into lessons. Azula practiced forms on the beach, sand scorching under blue fire. Zuko stared at waves, wondering if honor meant leaving this behind. By war's outbreak, Ember Island ghosted into memory. Estates stood empty, beaches untrod except by patrols. Ursa vanished one night. Rumours say she sailed from those same shores, leaving her paradise tainted. Years later, Zuko returned, not as banished prince, but Fire Lord surveying reconstruction. The veranda creaked under his weight, waves unchanged. He touched the family portrait, faded but familiar, and felt Ember Island's truth. Paradise isn't place, but people who make it so. What remains when laughter fades and war claims even beaches, echoes in the surf pulling you under if you listen too long? If there were an MVP of collateral damage in Avatar, the Cabbage Merchant would win every season, hands down. His plight is not just comic relief, it's a heartbreaking testament to the chaos that follows Team Avatar wherever they go. Before the gang stumbled into his unlucky existence, The cabbage merchant was probably just a regular guy with a simple dream. Sell cabbages, feed his family, maybe expand to cucumbers someday. His cart was his pride and joy, lovingly balanced with cabbages stacked just so, ready to brighten the dinners of countless middle-class families. Then soccer happened. Every mission, every battle, every escape sees his cart getting destroyed in spectacular fashion. Cabbages tumble, wheels break. His shouts of "my cabbages" echo through alleys and battlefields alike. It's a running joke, yes, but there's also something tragic about watching someone lose their livelihood repeatedly and still being forced to pick up the pieces. The world is burning, spirits are warring, empires rise and fall, but the merchant's cabbage cart is the single constant casualty. He doesn't cage himself in despair, though. There's resilience in that repeated destruction, a stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, the next cart will make it through. Behind the comedy, his story is the silent narrative of the ordinary people caught in the tidal waves of history, the farmers and vendors who aren't heroes but whose lives matter just as much. He reminds us that while heroes battle, fire lords and spirits, it's the little guys who keep the world turning, who feed the fighters, who suffer the smallest but most personal losses. So next time you hear his cry, don't just laugh. Remember the cabbages and the merchant who lost them again. In a war that changes the fate of nations, sometimes it's the humble cabbage cart that carries the weight of the wrongs we never see. Ba Sing Se wasn't built for equality. It was built for control. The crown gleamed from the inner wall, where daily agents whispered in marble corridors, and the Earth King hosted banquets that could feed entire villages. Beyond the middle ring's merchants and scholars lay the lower ring, a sprawling maze of crumbling tenements, polluted canals and shanties where millions scraped by on dreams that never materialized. This was where the war refugees washed up, where Earth Kingdom citizens fled Fire Nation invasions only to find a different kind of occupation. Life here moved at survival speed. Street vendors hawked questionable meat skewers while pickpockets worked the crowds. Laundry hung from every window, flapping like defeated flags. The air smelled of coal smoke, sewage, and desperation cooked into every brick. Factories churned out weapons for a war nobody talked about, employing children whose parents had vanished into refugee lines or daily prisons. Water came from communal pumps that often ran dry. Food meant standing in lines that snaked around blocks for rice rations doled out by bored officials. The daily surveillance was omnipresent but subtle. Brainwashed informants blended into markets, reporting disloyal conversations. Anything that questioned the war, the king, or the city's impenetrable walls. Curfews hit hardest here, where night markets were the only economy that worked. Disappearances happened quietly. A neighbour who spoke too loudly about Fire Nation atrocities gone by morning, family told he relocated for work. The lower ring learned fast to keep heads down, smiles practiced, opinions buried. Refugees carried stories that curdled in the telling. Southern Water Tribe families who lost villages to Fire Nation raids, now crammed into single rooms, their waterbending suppressed by fear of exposure. Earth Kingdom farmers whose fields burned, reduced to factory shifts that mangled hands and lungs. No glory, no heroism, just the slow erosion of identity under bureaucracy's weight. Judy, the tour guide avatar, smiled through it all. Ba Sing Se is the safest city in the world. Nothing bad ever happens here. Yet resistance flickered in shadows. Underground networks smuggled messages from the resistance. Black market healers treated daily torture victims. Children played games mimicking upper flights, whispering about the avatar like a prayer. Jin, the girl who crushed on Jet before his rage turned toxic, represented the lower ring's fragile hope. Ordinary people clinging to normalcy amid engineered oblivion. Most never reached the upper ring. The promise of prosperity was a lie for control, walls within walls ensuring the powerful stayed insulated while the lower ring bore the war's unseen cost. They weren't soldiers or heroes, just people who kept the city running while forgetting how to dream beyond ration lines. What does it say about a great civilization when its foundation is built on people too broken to revolt, too hopeful to despair completely? Ba Sing Se endured because the lower ring endured, invisible and unbreakable in their quiet persistence. 100 years old, still fighting like a mad genius, and playing the fool so well that even his closest allies wondered if he was bluffing. King Bumi of Amashu wasn't just surviving the Fire Nation occupation, he was outlasting it, one eccentric scheme at a time. Before the war, Bumi ruled a thriving mountain city of ingenious delivery systems and mechanical wonders. Amashu slid packages down chutes, diverted rivers for fun, and celebrated Earth Festival with games that tested wits more than strength. Bumi embodied that spirit, bearded, wild-eyed, earthbending with the force of landslides, but the precision of a watchmaker. His people loved him not for power, but for the sheer joy of his unpredictable rule. Sozin's comet changed everything. Fire Nation airships darkened the sky, tanks rolled through streets, and Bumi watched his city fall. He could have fought, might have won even against initial forces. Instead, he surrendered. Not from weakness, but strategy. The time is not right, he'd say later. As a master earthbender, he understood waiting better than fighting. Mountains don't rush, they endure. For a century, Bumi became the Mad King. Locked in his palace tower, he feigned senility while the Fire Nation installed puppet governors. To them, he was harmless, a relic ranting about birthdays and rock candy. They never suspected he was earthbending in secret, mapping every tunnel, every weak point, every soldier's patrol route. He aged into a living fossil, beard like a waterfall, but his mind sharpened like a buried blade. Underground, resistance flickered. Bumi contacted loyalists through vibrations, subtle tremors carrying messages only earthbenders felt. He trained young rebels in forgotten caverns, teaching not just bending but patience. Fooled ya became code for outsmarting occupiers. Fire Nation officers dismissed his birthday parties as lunacy, unaware they masked supply runs for freedom fighters. What sustained him? Madness, maybe, or genius. Bumi understood the war's true weapon: time. Fire Nation soldiers rotated home. He stayed. Governors aged and died. He endured. He watched generations pass, marking each loss but never breaking. Earthbending philosophy, neutral gin like water, kept him grounded amid erosion. When Aang returned, Bumi revealed his hand. Amashu liberated in hours. Earthbending shattered tanks. Gliders plummeted. Soldiers fled a madman who'd been waiting all along. Victory wasn't rage, it was revelation. Bumi's century raises questions. Was playing mad heroic patience or cruel deception of his people? Did waiting cost more lives than fighting? In war's calculus, maybe both. But his unbreakable spirit proved one truth. True power isn't destroying enemies. It's surviving until the moment arrives, then striking with a century's pent-up force. Fooled them all, and won. Long before Katara dressed in green robes and rode a makeshift boat through polluted waters, there was a real spirit haunting the rivers of the Fire Nation-occupied Earth Kingdom. Not a costume, not a trick. A genuine tragedy given form, bound to a river by grief and duty that even death couldn't wash away. Her story begins generations before the 100-Year War, in a riverside village that thrived on fishing and trade. The Painted Lady was human once, a healer, midwife, protector, who painted her face with river clay to blend herbal medicines into masks that terrified away bandits and disease. Villagers called her a spirit even in life, whispering her legend as she ferried the sick across waters, delivered babies under moonlight, mended fevers with poultices that smelled of earth and desperation. She died saving her village from plague, tended the infected without rest until sickness claimed her, body slipping silently into the river she loved. But spirits don't always pass cleanly. Her connection to the water, to the life it carried, the people it sustained, was too deep. She became what they called her, the Painted Lady, eternally rowing her boat, face forever marked by clay, appearing to those in need but never speaking, never resting. For decades, she guided fishermen through fog, warned of floods with lantern lights on the water, carried souls of the drowned to peaceful shores. Villagers left offerings at river shrines, rice, flowers, painted faces on paper lanterns, honouring the spirit who asked nothing but gave everything. Then the Fire Nation came. Factories choked the river with poison. Fish died in floating masses. Villages upstream diverted water for war machines, leaving nothing but mud and sickness. The Painted Lady's river, their river, turned toxic, and she suffered with it. Her appearances grew desperate. Lanterns flickered warnings ignored by factory overseers. Her boat rode against currents of filth, trying to cleanse what industry had poisoned. But spirits have limits. She couldn't fight steel and ambition, only plead through signs that greed dismissed as superstition. By Katara's time, the painted lady was fading. Her glow dimmed, form translucent, able to ease fevers but not cure the poison at the source. Villagers still left offerings, still prayed, but hope curdled into resignation. The spirit who once saved them now mirrored their defeat, trapped in eternal vigil over waters that killed rather than sustained. Katara saw the truth immediately, impersonated the spirit not to deceive, but to act where the real painted lady couldn't. Rowed the boat, healed the sick, destroyed the factory, not as trickery, but partnership. The spirit watched, silent approval in her painted eyes, finally able to rest as clean water flowed again. What bound her wasn't malice or curse, but love too profound for death. A healer's oath to her people, her river, unbreakable even as both withered. Katara freed her not by banishing the spirit, but restoring what duty demanded: balance. In a world of avatars and fire lords, sometimes the deepest tragedies are quiet ones. A painted face on misty water, rowing forever for people who forgot to fight for themselves, until someone reminds them. Her lantern still glows on clear nights, guiding safe passages. But now the river runs clean, and the painted lady rows with purpose restored, eternal protector of waters that heal rather than harm. Balance isn't defeating the bad guys. It's maintaining the delicate equilibrium between four nations, four elements, human ambition, and spiritual forces that predate all of them. The Avatar exists as the living embodiment of that tension, a human-spirit hybrid tasked with preventing any one side from overwhelming the others. Think of the world as a massive, interconnected machine. Fire Nation expansion tips the scale toward conquest, smothering earth and water. Air nomad pacifism swings too far toward detachment, ignoring human conflict. The Avatar doesn't pick winners. They restore the mechanism's natural rhythm, ensuring fire warms rather than burns, earth endures rather than stagnates, water flows rather than floods, air frees rather than evades. Philosophically, balance demands the impossible, embody contradictory truths. Aang learned air's freedom but had to confront fire's passion. Roku balanced nations but failed personal relationships. Kyoshi enforced justice through ruthlessness. Each avatar grapples with their era's imbalance, their personality filtering cosmic duty through human limits. Past lives guide, but the current soul decides. Balance isn't formulaic. It's intuitive, messy, deeply personal. Cosmically, the Avatar bridges Rava's light and Vatu's chaos, human innovation and spirit wildness. Without them, unchecked bending escalates into cataclysm. Sozin's genocide, Unalak's spirit portals, Kuvara's spirit weapons. Balance prevents apocalypse by mediating, not ruling, the world's competing forces. What happens when the Avatar fails? Roku trusted Sozin too long. Aang froze for a century. Korra severed her connection. Yet balance persists, demanding the next cycle adapt. True equilibrium isn't static utopia. It's dynamic tension where opposites coexist, evolve, occasionally threaten destruction, but never quite achieve it. The Avatar represents humanity's highest potential, aware enough to sense imbalance, powerful enough to correct it, humble enough to know perfection's impossible. In a universe of cycles, their role reminds us that saving the world means preserving its contradictions, not erasing them. Katara stood at the edge of that lonely fishing village, wind whipping her parka, staring at the man who'd murdered her mother. Yon Ra, former Fire Nation lieutenant, now a broken nobody hiding in the Southern Water Tribe's shadow. 12 years of rage boiled down to this moment, his face inches from hers, powerless, begging for the mercy he'd never shown. Justice screamed for blood. Waterbenders don't forget. Katara's mother, Kaya, had lied to protect her daughter, taken the killing blow meant for an 8-year-old girl. Every full moon since, Katara had bent oceans of grief, channeling loss into power. Yon-Ra deserved to die, slowly, horribly, for that theft. Her tribe would cheer, Aang would understand, even if it broke his pacifist heart. Revenge wasn't vengeance, it was balance, eye for frozen eye. Forgiveness whispered differently, not absolution, Yonra's crime stained forever, but release. Killing him wouldn't resurrect Kaya, wouldn't heal the hole in her family, wouldn't undo the war that birthed the monster. Mercy meant denying him the power of her rage, proving she was more than the violence he'd unleashed. But could she? After bending blood from Hammer's prison lessons, after vowing never to let pain define her, could Mercy coexist with justice? She chose. Waterbending dagger inches from his throat, Katara saw not a villain, but a man reduced by his own choices. That's it, she spat, lowering her arm. No kill, no easy catharsis, just walking away, leaving him alive with his cowardice. The aftermath lingered. Katara wept. Not relief, but exhaustion. Justice felt incomplete. Forgiveness, hollow. Aang held her, understanding the cost better than anyone. She'd carried the wound not as scar but living teacher. Some grief doesn't heal, it transforms, forces growth through pain you never escape. Her choice echoed the Avatar's burden. True justice isn't punishment, it's restoration. Mercy doesn't erase crime, it reclaims power from it. Katara didn't forgive Yonra. She forgave herself for surviving, for bending forward instead of breaking backward. What would you have done? Parker snapping in the wind, Mother's killer kneeling? Katara's answer haunts because it's both victory and defeat. Some wounds scar over but never stop aching. They just teach you to fight carrying the pain. Aang never wanted to be the Avatar. He ran from it, literally into a storm that froze him for a century. Destiny found him anyway, crashing back into his life with the weight of 10,000 years and a world on fire. But was it fate that made him the bridge between worlds, or choice that defined how he'd cross it? Past avatars whispered through meditations and visions, Roku's regrets, Kyoshi's ruthlessness, Yang Chen's unyielding duty. They embodied the cycle, born into predetermined roles, shaped by cosmic necessity. Aang heard their voices urging him toward the correct path, master elements, defeat Ozai, restore balance. Destiny's script felt ironclad. Fire Lord must die, Comet must be stopped, world saved exactly as history demanded. Yet Aang pushed back. Air Nomad teachings clashed with Avatar expectations, freedom versus fate, joy versus sacrifice. Every fork in the road tested him. Energy bend Ozai instead of killing. Refuse the lion spring. Choose love over conquest. Past lives called it madness, heresy even. Roku failed by trusting Sozin's destiny. Kyoshi enforced justice through violence. But Aang saw destiny as suggestion, not shackle. Fate provided the stage, free will wrote the lines. His struggle peaked atop Wulong Volcano. Lion Turtle's wisdom unlocked energy bending. Change a man's heart, rewrite his destiny. Ozai, fueled by Sozin's imperial vision, represented unchecked fate, conquest as manifest superiority. Aang could have fulfilled the cycle, ended the war with blood. Instead, he chose removal, stripped Ozai's bending, proved free will could bend destiny itself. What does it mean when the Avatar rejects the Avatar's role? Aang's path exposed the lie. Destiny isn't linear. Past lives weren't infallible gods. They were humans wrestling the same chains. Free will emerges in refusal, the courage to write your ending despite cosmic pressure. Aang didn't escape fate. He redefined it, proving balance thrives not in obedience, but adaptation. Destiny handed him the world to save. Free will decided how, not as destroyer but transformer. Roku followed the path and lost everything. Aang forged his own and saved his soul. Which path would you choose when every voice from history screams you're wrong? Hammer didn't start as a monster. She was a healer from the Southern Water Tribe, full moon festivals dancing in her blood, bending waves for her village's joy. Then Fire Nation raids shattered that world. Women captured, men left slaughtered. The tribe's bending legacy gutted. The prison was Fire Nation ingenuity at its cruelest. A coastal fortress where tides ruled everything. Cells flooded at high tide, drained at low. Waterbenders drowned or dehydrated in cycles. bending useless against stone and iron. Haima endured decades, full moons rising without escape, watching sisters waste away. Survival meant innovation. Bloodbending, discovered one moonlit night when desperation bent the water in her own veins, then her guards. She practiced in secret, full moons her only window. Bent rats first, feeling their tiny heartbeats pulse under control, then plants, squeezing moisture from roots. Guards next, subtle at first, loosening their bladders during sweeps, building to full paralysis. Bloodbending wasn't power, it was weaponized trauma. Every twist a scream she'd internalized for survival. Escape came brutally. Full moon night, Hammer paralyzed an entire patrol, walked free dripping crimson intent, but freedom hollowed her. The healer who'd mended fishermen now hunted Fire Nation soldiers like prey. Full moons her carnival of revenge. Plants bent into cages, fishermen forced to restrain their own, Katara witnessing the perversion of her element. Hammer's innovation birthed Bloodbending's curse. Desperation innovates, but trauma transforms, teachers into tormentors, survival into sadism. She begged Katara to embrace it. It's not torture, it's justice. But Katara saw truth. Bending her people's blood chained Hammer more than any cell. Captured again, Hammer returned to prison unbowed. Her legacy a forbidden technique haunting waterbenders forever. Outlawed by Avatar edict, used only under duress, bloodbending stands as warning. Innovation from pain doesn't heal, it festers. What breaks first, the body or the soul that bends its own chains into weapons? Hammer survived her cage, but freedom's cost scarred deeper than iron ever could. The peaceful harmony of the air nomads was shattered on the day Sozin's comet blazed through the sky. Sozin, a Fire Lord blinded by visions of empire, chose that moment to execute a plan centuries in the making, the complete annihilation of the air nomads. It wasn't a battle, it was a calculated genocide designed to eradicate the Avatar before he could fully master his power. For a people who valued detachment and flight, grounded in spirituality and non-violence, the genocide was an unthinkable betrayal. Temples burned while masters and students alike were hunted down with ruthless efficiency. Sounds of fire and screams replaced the peaceful chants and laughter that once echoed through the mountain air. The world lost an entire culture, a living philosophy and countless innocent lives, all in a single, cataclysmic event. Aang was the only one to survive, preserved in an iceberg not just by chance, but by the desperate hope of fate. The genocide wasn't just a military strike, it was a wound that rippled through every nation, shifting the balance of power and setting the stage for the 100-Year War. The loss of the air nomads remains the series' darkest moment, a reminder of how ambition corrupted and hate destroyed. Their extinction was not just a physical loss but a spiritual one, the death of an entire way of being that embraced freedom, peace and balance. What does it mean to be the last of your kind? To carry a history so steeped in peace that your survival demands you become a warrior? Aang's guilt, his loneliness, and his responsibility are all tethered to that tragedy. The genocide is the day the world changed, and the day the Avatar's real journey began, not just to defeat Fire Lord Ozai, but to heal a world broken beyond repair. Sometimes, surviving is only the beginning of the burden you must carry, and sometimes the weight of loss is the heaviest kind of bending to master. Hakoda wasn't just a chief, he was the anchor for a shattered tribe. When Fire Nation raids decimated the Southern Water Tribe, leaving villages in flames and waterbenders captured or killed, Hakoda made the hardest call: leave his children behind to lead the fight. He rallied survivors into a fleet of warriors, fishermen turned sailors, hunters turned tacticians. Their campaigns were guerrilla brilliance, hit-and-run raids on supply lines, ambushes in fog-shrouded fjords, sabotage of Fire Nation ships under cover of blizzards. Hakoda's flagship became legend, striking from icebergs like a vengeful spirit. They liberated prison ships, rescued captured benders, kept hope flickering in the south, where children like Katara and Sokka raised themselves on stories of absent fathers, but every victory cost. Letters home grew sparse, comrades fell to superior numbers, Families waited years for fathers who might never return. Hakoda bore the weight, commanding men who left children his age, knowing each battle risked becoming just another ghost story for the next generation. Off-screen, his strategies shaped the war. Water Tribe fleets disrupted Fire Nation blockades, bought time for Earth Kingdom defences, forced Ozai to divert resources. When Aang surfaced, Hakoda's warriors joined the final push, not as saviours, but brothers in arms carrying a century's grudges. The cost, irreparable. Sons grew without fathers, traditions frayed, tribe reduced to villages. Hakoda returned a hero, but haunted. Reunion with Katara bittersweet amid unspoken years. Heroism from afar looks noble. Up close, it's children learning to hunt alone while fathers chase ghosts across frozen seas. What breaks a man more, watching your world burn, or leaving it to burn while you fight shadows elsewhere? Hakoda chose duty, but the scars ran deeper than any raid. The Earth Kingdom is vast, a sprawling mosaic of towering mountains, dense forests, dusty plains, and sprawling cities that hum with life and complexity. When Team Avatar travelled through it, the saga wasn't just pulse-pounding battles or grand political upheavals. There were moments between, the quiet campfires, the local villages, the nights beneath wide, star-studded skies where no war seemed to touch the world. Imagine the soundscape, crackling flames, gentle rustling of leaves, whispering winds carrying distant calls of nocturnal animals. Conversations drift among companions, stories from Sokka's childhood, Toph's sardonic quips about world-class blindness, Aang's hopeful gaze at constellations he hopes to protect. These moments are unassuming, almost invisible under the weight of destiny, but they bind the group as surely as fire binds fuel. Villages past weren't merely backdrops, but living, breathing communities with their own dreams and fears. A farmer's simple pride in her harvest, a child shyly showing off a new airbending trick, an elder recounting legends older than the Avatar cycle. A tapestry of human experience amid relentless conflict. The journey also revealed the Earth Kingdom's fractures. Remote regions suffered neglect or corruption, with local warlords exploiting their own people. Sometimes Team Avatar's arrival was a moment of hope. Sometimes it stirred unrest. Through it all, resilience lingered in the faces they met, the determination to endure, adapt, and dream of peace. Travelling was an education beyond bending styles and combat tactics. It was a reminder to Aang of what he fought for, not just to end a war, but to preserve these fleeting, fragile moments of humanity. When the world was paused under those quiet skies, the Avatar's burden felt lighter, a shared weight carrying the hope that even in chaos, life endures and blossoms. What stories would you hear if you sat with them by the fire? What dreams whispered across those silent nights? Sometimes, the greatest journeys are in the pauses between battles. There's a moment late in the war when the impossible happens. A Fire Nation general, an Earth Kingdom king, a Water Tribe master, a Fire Nation deserter, and a non-bending swordsman stand together on the same battlefield, not as enemies, but as brothers. They're wearing white robes marked with a lotus symbol, and they're about to liberate Ba Sing Se from the nation some of them were born to serve. This is the Order of the White Lotus, and their story is about the most radical idea the Avatar world ever produced, that wisdom matters more than borders, and that the people who understand the world best might be the ones who refuse to pick a side in its wars. The Order didn't start as a resistance movement. Centuries before the 100-Year War, it began as something simpler, a club for intellectuals who loved playing Pai Sho. Picture it. Scholars from different nations gathering in tea houses, moving tiles across boards, sharing perspectives on philosophy, science, and the nature of the world. They weren't plotting revolution. They were just people who believed that knowledge transcended national identity, that the pursuit of truth mattered more than flags and armies. They named themselves after the White Lotus tile, the rarest, most valuable piece in the game. But it was also their secret handshake. Members would arrange tiles in a specific pattern during Pai Sho matches, forming a bloomed lotus with the White Lotus chip at the centre. To anyone else, it looked like a normal game. To another member, it was instant recognition. You're one of us. The Order was already active by the time of Avatar Yang Chen, with Air Nomad members helping her investigate threats to world stability. By Avatar Kuruk's era, they'd grown into a shadow organization that watched over the Avatar's development, though they worked so quietly that most people never knew they existed. When Avatar Kyoshi turned out to be homeless and impossible to identify, the White Lotus mistakenly trained the wrong kid for years, their first major failure and one that taught them humility. But everything changed when Firelord Sozin decided conquest was more important than balance. The Air Nomad genocide shattered the White Lotus's quiet approach. They couldn't find Avatar Aang before he disappeared into the iceberg. They couldn't stop the Fire Nation's expansion. And suddenly, the philosophers and scholars realized that knowledge without action was just words, so they went underground. Deeper than before, White Lotus members infiltrated the Fire Nation military, sabotaged supply lines, passed intelligence between nations, and protected vulnerable communities, all while maintaining absolute secrecy. If you were caught, you died alone. No one would claim your body. No one would acknowledge your sacrifice. You'd just be another casualty of a war that seemed endless. Iroh joined after his son Lu Ten died during the siege of Ba Sing Se. The loss broke something fundamental in him, the belief that Fire Nation glory justified the cost. When he returned home, he began his search for meaning, and the White Lotus found him. Or maybe he found them. Either way, the Dragon of the West became their Grand Lotus, the leader of an organization dedicated to everything his nation opposed. He wasn't alone. King Bumi had been a member for decades, ruling Omashu while secretly undermining Fire Nation occupation plans. Master Pakku brought Water Tribe knowledge and the healing arts. Zhong, the first Fire Nation deserter to survive, offered his mastery of flames and his bone-deep hatred of what his element had become. Piandao, the greatest swordsman alive, contributed strategy and proof that non-benders could stand equal to any master. These weren't just skilled fighters, they were legends, the best their nations had ever produced, and they'd all looked at the war, at the propaganda, at the endless justifications for violence and said, "No, not in our names." The beauty of the White Lotus was its diversity. Fire Nation members fought against their own armies. Earth Kingdom masters protected Fire Nation refugees. Water Tribe healers saved enemy soldiers. The organization embodied the Avatar's purpose, being the bridge between worlds, even when the Avatar himself was missing. They didn't advertise, they didn't recruit publicly. If you were worthy, if you demonstrated wisdom that transcended nationalism, a member might challenge you to a Paisho game. Move your tiles the wrong way, and it was just a pleasant afternoon. Move them correctly, and suddenly you were part of something that had existed for centuries. A family bound not by blood or borders, but by the shared belief that the world could be better than its worst impulses. For 100 years they operated in absolute shadow. No glory, no recognition, just old masters growing older, training the next generation in secret, waiting for a bald kid with arrows to wake up and give them a reason to hope again. And then Sozin's comet returned. The Fire Nation prepared for its final push, burning the Earth Kingdom to ash, ending the war through genocide. Iroh made the call. No more hiding. The White Lotus was coming out of the shadows, and they were bringing a century of pent-up resistance with them. Ba Sing Se had fallen years earlier, the greatest city in the world, conquered and occupied. Reclaiming it would require an army. The White Lotus brought a dozen old people and enough combined skill to make armies irrelevant. They fought through Fire Nation battalions like they were teaching a particularly aggressive class. Bumi hurled buildings. Pakku turned the city's canals into weapons. Zhong created walls of flame that made enemy firebenders reconsider their career choices. Piandao moved through soldiers like he was choreographing a dance where everyone else forgot their steps. By the time the comet faded, Ba Sing Se was free. The White Lotus had revealed itself to the world, and the world realized that the old masters they'd dismissed as relics were actually the most dangerous people alive. But revealing themselves came with a cost. Some members believed the Order had abandoned its true purpose, pursuing truth and sharing knowledge, to become servants of the Avatar. After the war, internal tensions grew. A faction led by a member named Zai Bao deserted, believing the White Lotus had traded philosophy for politics. That schism would eventually birth the Red Lotus, a darker reflection that valued freedom over balance and chaos over order. Still, the Order endured. When Aang died and Avatar Korra was discovered, the White Lotus publicly took responsibility for training and protecting her. They built compounds, stationed sentries, became the Avatar's official guardians. It was everything they'd once avoided. Visible, institutional, connected to world governments. Were they right to step into the light? Did revealing themselves save the Order, or destroy what made it special? The answer probably depends on whether you value survival or purity of purpose. But here's what matters. For centuries, the White Lotus proved that identity is a choice, that you can love your nation without serving its worst impulses, that wisdom recognizes no borders, and the people most dangerous to tyrants aren't the ones with the most power. They're the ones who refuse to use it for the wrong reasons. A Fire Nation general and an Earth Kingdom king playing pai sho in a tea house, moving tiles that form a lotus, knowing that despite everything their nations demand, they're brothers in the only war that truly matters, the fight to make the world worth saving. Sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't picking up a sword, it's sitting down with your enemy, realizing they're not your enemy at all, and building something together that transcends everything trying to tear you apart. The story we know is simple. Zuko's mother disappeared in the middle of the night. One evening she was there, tucking her son into bed. The next morning she was gone, and her husband was suddenly Fire Lord. For Zuko, it was the defining tragedy of his life. For the Fire Nation, it was just another royal secret buried under layers of ash and propaganda. But that night wasn't just a disappearance, it was a transaction. To understand why Ursa left, you have to understand the impossible choice she was given. It started with a request from Fire Lord Azulon, a cruel, calculated punishment for his son Ozai. Ozai had dared to ask for the throne, arguing that Iroh's grief over Lu Ten made him unfit to rule. Azulon's response? If you want the throne so badly, you should know what it feels like to lose a firstborn son. He ordered Ozai to kill Zuko. Most fathers would have refused. Most fathers would have fought. Ozai prepared to do it. That's the horror Ursa walked into. She didn't stumble upon a plot, she interrupted an execution. When she discovered Ozai's intention, she didn't beg. She didn't appeal to his non-existent heart. She made a deal. She offered him the throne, the one thing he wanted more than his son's death. In exchange for Zuko's life, she would provide an untraceable, colourless, odourless poison to kill Fire Lord Azulon, clearing the path for Ozai's ascension. Ozai accepted, but his terms were brutal. Once the deed was done, Ursa had to leave. Forever. She couldn't take her children. She couldn't say goodbye to anyone but them. If she ever tried to return, or if she tried to take the kids with her, he would hunt them all down. The tragedy of that night isn't just that she left, it's how she left. She went to Zuko's room first. He was asleep, safe only because his mother had just traded her life for his. She woke him up, gently, quietly, just to look at him one last time. She pulled up his blankets and whispered the words that would haunt him for years. Zuko, please, my love, listen to me. Everything I've done to protect you. Never forget who you are. Then she went to Azula's room. Azula was awake, or pretending to be asleep. We don't know for sure, but we know Ursa didn't wake her. She stood in the doorway, looked at the daughter who was already so much like her father, and hesitated. What do you say to the child you're leaving behind in a monster's care? How do you explain that you're abandoning her to save her brother? Ursa kissed her forehead, whispered a goodbye that Azula may or may not have heard, and walked away. That moment broke Azula. In her mind, her mother chose Zuko. Her mother loved Zuko enough to say goodbye, but left her with nothing but silence. It was the seed of the madness that would eventually consume her, the voice in the mirror screaming that her mother thought she was a monster. Ursa walked out of the palace gates in the dead of night, leaving behind her royalty, her children, and her identity. She returned to her home village of Hira, but the pain of what she'd lost was too much to bear. She eventually made another desperate choice. She visited the Mother of Faces, a spirit who could grant a new appearance and a new life. Ursa chose to forget. She erased her memories of the palace, of Ozai, and tragically of her children. She became Noriko, a woman with a gentle smile and no past, living a simple life while her son wandered the world in exile and her daughter descended into madness. It wasn't until years later, after the war, after Zuko became Fire Lord, that the truth came out. Zuko found her. He restored her face and her memories. And in one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire saga, Ursa looked at the man her son had become and realized that her sacrifice had worked. He was alive. He was good. He was the Fire Lord who ended the war, but the cost was high. That night in the palace didn't just change political succession. It shattered a family. It created a scar on Zuko's heart long before Ozai burned his face. It broke Azula's mind, and it proved that in the Fire Nation royal family, love was the most dangerous weakness of all. Ursa's farewell wasn't a mystery. It was a mother walking into the dark so her son could one day walk into the light. And she did it without hesitation, without regret, paying the price for a future she wasn't sure she'd ever get to see. Imagine being one of the strongest people on the planet, capable of throwing entire buildings like they were pebbles, and deciding that your best strategy for saving the world is to act like a senile old man for 100 years. This is the paradox of King Bumi. To most of the world, Bumi was just the eccentric, cackling ruler of Omashu, a man who wore weird outfits, snorted when he laughed, and seemed about 3 bad days away from total insanity. But that madness was a mask. Beneath the wild eyes and the chaotic energy lived a master tactician who understood something that every other world leader missed. Sometimes, the only way to win is to do absolutely nothing. This is the philosophy of neutral Jing. Most benders understand 2 types of energy: positive Jing, attacking, and negative Jing, retreating or defending. Firebenders are all about positive action. Airbenders master the negative. But earthbending requires something else. It requires listening. It requires waiting. It requires standing perfectly still while the world screams at you to move, holding your ground until the exact nanosecond when action becomes inevitable. Bumi didn't just practice this in combat. He lived it for a century. Think about his timeline. He was Aang's childhood friend, a wild kid who used to slide down mail delivery chutes. Then the war started. The air nomads were wiped out. Aang disappeared. The Fire Nation began its slow, grinding conquest of the Earth Kingdom. Bumi watched his friends die, his allies fall, and the world he knew burn down around him. He could have fought. He could have led armies, crushed Fire Nation battalions, maybe even liberated territory. But Bumi was a master earthbender. He knew that fighting before the time was right was just wasted energy. He knew that a rock doesn't attack the stream. It waits for the water to flow around it. So he waited. He stayed in Omashu. He cultivated his mad genius persona so thoroughly that even his own people underestimated him. He let the Fire Nation believe he was just a harmless old relic, and when they finally invaded Omashu, he did the unthinkable. He surrendered. Can you imagine the discipline that took? To see enemy soldiers marching through your streets, to see your people captured, to feel the vibration of their tanks on your earth, and choose not to crush them? He had the power to bury that entire invasion force in seconds. But he knew that fighting then would destroy the city he was trying to protect. So he allowed himself to be captured, encased in a metal box and dangled from a crane like a trophy. Critics called him a coward. Even Aang, when he first found out, was horrified. "Why didn't you free yourself?" he asked. "What's the matter with you?" Bumi's answer was simple. "I'm waiting for the right moment." And that moment came during the Day of Black Sun. For 8 minutes the firebenders lost their power. While the rest of the world was frantically launching invasions or hiding in bunkers, Bumi simply flexed. He broke out of his metal prison, liberated his city, and single-handedly kicked the Fire Nation out of Omashu before the eclipse was even over. He didn't need an army, he didn't need a plan B, he just needed 8 minutes of neutral Jing to pay off. This wasn't madness. It was the ultimate expression of earthbending philosophy. Bumi understood that time is a weapon. While the Fire Nation exhausted themselves trying to conquer the world, spreading their forces thin, burning through their resources and their spirit, Bumi conserved his energy. He let them overextend. He let them believe they had won. And then, when the balance finally tipped, he struck with the force of a landslide. His lesson to Aang, that he needed an earthbending teacher who waits and listens, wasn't just advice about fighting styles. It was a lesson about survival. Aang had to learn that being the Avatar wasn't just about action. It was about timing. It was about knowing when to strike and when to endure. Bumi's century of madness was actually a century of intense, agonizing discipline. He played the fool so perfectly that nobody saw the Grandmaster hiding in plain sight. He watched the world suffer for 100 years, carrying the weight of inaction, trusting that his patience would eventually save more lives than his rage ever could. In the end, the Mad King was the sanest man in the Earth Kingdom. He proved that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how long you can wait to hit back. Avatar Kyoshi created them to be protectors, guards of culture, defenders of knowledge, elite earthbenders who would preserve Ba Sing Se's heritage against those who would corrupt or destroy it. She built them from the ground up, trained them personally, instilled in them a code of honor, and gave them a sacred mission: protect the Earth Kingdom's heart. 3 centuries later, those same protectors were erasing memories, disappearing citizens, and gaslighting an entire city into believing there was no war. The Dai Li's fall from grace isn't just a cautionary tale about institutional rot. It's a masterclass in how the best intentions can mutate into the worst atrocities when power becomes more important than purpose. In Kyoshi's time, the Dai Li were necessary. Ba Sing Se was under constant threat, not just from external enemies, but from internal corruption. Peasant uprisings, noble conspiracies, criminal organizations that threatened the city's stability. The Earth King needed an organization that operated outside the bureaucracy's slow-moving gears. He needed people who could act decisively, who understood that sometimes preserving peace required getting your hands dirty. Kyoshi gave him exactly that. She handpicked the first Dai Li agents from the most skilled earthbenders in the kingdom. She taught them techniques that regular soldiers would never learn: underground surveillance, subtle manipulation of architecture to control crowds, precision strikes that could neutralize threats without collateral damage. They were elite. They were efficient. And most importantly, they were loyal to the ideal of Ba Sing Se, not to any individual ruler. For generations it worked. The Dai Li operated in the shadows, preventing coups, dismantling criminal networks, quietly removing threats before they could destabilize the city. They weren't perfect, no secret police ever are, but they served the kingdom's genuine interests. When the Earth King made foolish decisions, the Dai Li could push back. When corruption infected the bureaucracy, the Dai Li could root it out. But then the 100-Year War started, and everything changed. The war put unprecedented pressure on Ba Sing Se. Refugees poured in by the thousands, resources became scarce, fear became the city's constant companion, and the Dai Li, tasked with maintaining order, started making compromises. Small ones at first, silencing a few voices spreading panic, relocating some troublemakers to keep the peace. Controlling information flow to prevent mass hysteria. Each compromise made the next one easier. Each line crossed made the previous line seem arbitrary. And slowly, so slowly that nobody noticed until it was too late, the Dai Li stopped protecting the Earth Kingdom's culture and started protecting their own power. By the time Longfeng rose to become their leader, the transformation was complete. The Dai Li no longer served the Earth King, they controlled him. The young, naive Earth King was kept isolated in his palace, fed carefully curated information, convinced that his city was thriving while the outside world burned. If he asked questions, the Dai Li provided comfortable lies. If he pushed too hard, they'd gently redirect his attention to parties, to bare shows, to anything that kept him docile and manageable. The agents themselves had become something unrecognizable. They weren't earthbenders defending their home. They were thought police enforcing a manufactured reality. They arrested citizens for mentioning the war. They re-educated people whose memories contradicted the official narrative. They created an entire underground prison beneath Lake Laogai, where dissidents were psychologically broken and rebuilt into compliant servants of the state. The method was terrifyingly simple: isolation, repetition, hypnotic suggestion amplified by earth-bending vibrations. There is no war in Ba Sing Se. Over and over until the prisoner's mind accepted the lie as truth, until their own memories became suspect, until they thanked their captors for freeing them from the burden of dangerous knowledge. Jet experienced this firsthand. The freedom fighter who'd spent years fighting the Fire Nation was captured, brainwashed, and released back into society with a smile on his face and emptiness behind his eyes. When his memories started to resurface, the Dai Li simply took him again. This time, he didn't come back. The tragedy isn't that the Dai Li became villains, it's that they genuinely believed they were still the heroes. Longfeng didn't think he was a tyrant, he thought he was the only thing standing between Ba Sing Se and chaos. The agents didn't see themselves as oppressors, they saw themselves as the thin green line protecting the last bastion of Earth Kingdom civilization. Kyoshi's protectors had become exactly what she created them to prevent, an unaccountable power that answered to no one, that decided what truth was, that erased anyone who challenged their version of reality. When Azula arrived in Ba Sing Se and orchestrated Longfeng's downfall, the Dai Li didn't resist. They simply transferred their loyalty to a new master who promised them continued relevance. They helped the Fire Nation conquer the city from within, proving that their allegiance was never to the Earth Kingdom. It was to power itself, to the intoxicating certainty that they knew better than everyone else what was good for the people. Avatar Kyoshi built the Dai Li to protect culture. Instead, they became its greatest threat. Not through destruction, but through control. They didn't burn Ba Sing Se's heritage. They rewrote it, erased the inconvenient parts, and convinced an entire city that their cage was actually freedom. The saddest part? Somewhere in Lake Logai's depths, in the foundations of their underground prison, Kyoshi's original training manuals probably still existed. Documents outlining honor, duty, service. The Dai Li agents walked past them every day on their way to erase more memories, never realizing that the greatest betrayal wasn't abandoning their founder's mission, it was believing they were still fulfilling it. Most firebenders treat their element like a gift. It's power, it's ambition, it's the superior element that justifies their empire's expansion. They revel in the heat, the destruction, the sheer force of will required to turn breath into flame. Zhongjong treated it like a curse. We meet him as a legend in exile, the first man to desert the Fire Nation army and survive. But unlike other deserters who fled out of fear or selfishness, Zhongjong left because he saw too much. He was a prodigy, a master who trained some of the Fire Nation's elite soldiers, including a young Zhao. He knew firebending better than almost anyone alive, and that deep, intimate knowledge led him to a terrifying conclusion. Fire is the only element that consumes. Water heals, earth builds, air liberates. But fire only destroys. This philosophy shattered him. Imagine being born with a talent you fundamentally despise. Imagine being hailed as a genius for perfecting an art form that you believe is inherently evil. Zhongjong didn't just hate the war, he hated himself. He hated the spark in his gut, the heat in his breath, the fact that his very existence was tied to a force of devastation. When Aang found him, begging for a teacher, Zhongjong refused. Not because he was lazy or afraid, but because he was terrified of what Aang would become. He looked at this eager, undisciplined 12-year-old and saw a disaster waiting to happen. "You are weak," he told the Avatar. Not physically weak, but disciplined weak. He knew that giving fire to someone who didn't respect its danger was like handing a loaded weapon to a toddler. His teaching style reflected his trauma. He forced Aang to stand in a stream and push water for hours. No flames, no excitement, just boring, repetitive discipline. He was trying to teach Aang the one thing the Fire Nation had forgotten: restraint. The true mastery of fire isn't about how big a blast you can create, it's about how well you can keep it from burning down the world. But Zhongjong's tragedy is that he couldn't escape his own nature. He preached that fire was a curse, yet he was arguably the most powerful firebender of his generation next to Iroh and Ozai. When Zhao found him, Zhongjong didn't fight back with rage. He fought with walls. Massive, terrifying walls of fire that blocked rivers and burned without consuming the forest. It was a paradox. He used the element of destruction to create barriers, to protect, to flee. He turned fire into earth, using it for defense and structure rather than attack. His membership in the White Lotus reveals the depth of his redemption arc. Here was a man who believed his power was evil, standing shoulder to shoulder with masters who believed in balance. When he helped liberate Ba Sing Se, he didn't just blast soldiers. He hovered in the air, creating walls of flame that pushed the Fire Nation out without incinerating the city. He found a way to use his curse to heal the world. Zhong is the answer to the Fire Nation's propaganda. He is the proof that fire doesn't have to be fueled by anger or hatred. It can be fueled by regret, by caution, by the desperate consuming need to protect life from the very power you wield. He never learned to love his element like Iroh did. He never saw the warmth and life that the Sun Warriors worshipped. To the very end, Zhong remained a man haunted by his own potential, carrying the burden of a master who wishes he had never been born a bender at all. And maybe that's exactly the kind of firebender the world needed. Someone who understood that the most dangerous flame isn't the one the enemy throws at you, it's the one you light yourself if you don't respect what it can do. Most people remember Jet as the charming rebel with the wheat in his mouth, the boy who wanted to flood a village and got righteously called out for it. They remember him as a lesson about extremism, about how trauma can twist good intentions into something monstrous. But here's what gets lost. Jet wasn't a cautionary tale, he was a casualty, a child soldier manufactured by the same Fire Nation he was trying to destroy. The freedom fighters weren't a resistance group. They were orphans playing war because war was the only language they'd been taught. Every single kid in that treehouse had watched their families burn, their homes collapse. Their entire childhoods reduced to ash and screaming, and then the adults disappeared, killed, fled, or too broken to care, leaving a generation of children to raise themselves in the wreckage. So they did what children do when the world stops making sense. They created their own rules. They built a community in the trees, away from the ground where soldiers marched. They trained each other to fight, to survive, to hit first before anyone could hit them. And they chose a leader, the oldest, the strongest, the one who promised that if they followed him, they'd never feel powerless again. That was Jet's real crime. Not the violence, not the extremism. It was giving desperate kids hope that revenge could fill the hole where their families used to be. His plan to flood Gaipan village wasn't born from evil. It was born from math. Cold, brutal, child logic math. There were Fire Nation soldiers stationed there. Eliminating them would save Earth Kingdom lives down the line. Yes, civilians would die. Yes, innocent people would drown. But in Jet's mind, shaped by years of watching the Fire Nation slaughter innocents without consequence, collateral damage was just the price of winning. He'd learned that lesson from the best teachers, the soldiers who burned his village and probably didn't lose a single night's sleep over it. When Sokka stopped him, when the dam didn't break and the village survived, Jet didn't see it as redemption. He saw it as failure. Because in his world, mercy was weakness. Hesitation got people killed. The only thing keeping the freedom fighters alive was their willingness to do what adults wouldn't, to be as ruthless as their enemies. But here's where Jet's story gets truly tragic. He tried to change. After his failed attack, after being exiled by his own group, after wandering alone with nothing but his rage for company, Jet ended up in Ba Sing Se. He tried to start over. He got a job, found a place to live, attempted to be a normal teenager instead of a child soldier. He wanted to believe that the war could end without him having to become a monster to stop it. And then the Dai Li found him. They didn't kill him immediately, that would be too merciful. They took him to Lake Logai, strapped him down and rewired his brain. There is no war in Ba Sing Se. Over and over until Jet, who'd spent his entire adolescence fighting that war, who'd lost everything to that war, couldn't even remember it existed. They turned him into a smiling puppet who served tea and insisted everything was fine. When his memories started breaking through, when he saw Zuko and Iroh and something in his traumatized brain screamed Fire Nation, the Dai Li took him again. This time, they weren't interested in reprogramming. They were interested in cleanup. Jet died in a basement beneath Ba Sing Se, bleeding out from internal injuries while the city above him continued pretending there was no war. He died alone, abandoned by the group he'd tried to protect, unmourned by the society that had failed him from the beginning. Longshot and Smellerby, two of his freedom fighters, found out later. They didn't get a body. They didn't get closure. They just got the confirmation that the Earth Kingdom they'd been fighting for had killed their leader more thoroughly than the Fire Nation ever managed. The tragedy of Jet isn't that he became an extremist. It's that no one gave him an alternative. The Fire Nation murdered his childhood. The Earth Kingdom offered no support, no guidance, no acknowledgement that war orphans needed something other than weapons and rage. Even Team Avatar, who had the moral high ground, left him behind once they'd stopped his attack. They didn't help him heal, they just stopped him from hurting others and moved on. So Jet did what every abandoned, traumatized kid does. He kept fighting. Because fighting was the only thing that made him feel less powerless. Because revenge was the only emotion strong enough to drown out the grief. Because if he stopped moving, stopped planning, stopped hating, he'd have to actually process the fact that his entire family was dead and no one was coming to save him. The freedom fighters were never heroes, but they were never villains either. They were children who should have been in school, learning math and flirting with classmates and worrying about normal teenage things. Instead, they were in the forest, teaching themselves to kill, because the adults who started the war couldn't be bothered to protect the youngest casualties. Jet's wheat stalk, the one he always chewed, the signature accessory that made him look cool and confident, wasn't a character quirk. It was a pacifier, something to keep his mouth busy when the screaming in his head got too loud. Something to bite down on when the memories of his burning village threatened to break through whatever thin control he'd managed to maintain. War doesn't just kill people. It kills the children they would have become. Jet should have grown up to be someone extraordinary. A leader, a builder, maybe even someone who could have helped rebuild the world after the war. Instead, he died at 15 in a government basement, a loose end tied off by the same bureaucracy that had abandoned him years earlier. The Fire Nation burned his village, but the Earth Kingdom killed him. And somehow, that's the most devastating part of his story. Discovering that your own side can be just as monstrous as the enemy, just quieter about it. In a world where people throw mountains, redirect lightning, and turn oceans into weapons, the most dangerous man in the Fire Nation didn't bend anything at all. Piandao's element wasn't fire, water, earth, or air. It was intention. A simple strip of steel in his hands became something more terrifying than any comet-boosted fire blast, because he understood what every great warrior eventually learns: steel is only as sharp as the mind holding it. Piandao was born into Fire Nation nobility, raised in the same culture that produced generals, admirals and conquerors. He trained alongside firebenders who measured their worth in the size of their flames, and he watched those same men burn through soldiers and civilians alike in the name of honour and destiny. Where they saw glory, he saw waste. Where they saw power, he saw carelessness. So while his peers obsessed over perfecting their forms, Piandao walked away from bending altogether and dedicated himself to a craft that demanded something rarer than raw power: absolute discipline. His swordsmanship was never just about hitting harder or moving faster. He studied painting to learn composition and focus. He studied calligraphy to practice precision and patience. He studied landscape, architecture, philosophy, anything that would sharpen his perception, refine his timing, and teach him how to see the world as lines, angles, and opportunities. By the time he became a master, the sword was just the visible part of a much larger weapon, a mind that could read an opponent in a heartbeat and end a fight before it started. When Sokka arrived at his estate, Piandao saw exactly what the rest of the world saw: a clumsy, non-bending boy from a decimated tribe, desperate to matter in a war being fought by demigods. But Piandao also saw something else: creativity, adaptability, and the stubborn refusal to give up even when the odds were humiliatingly bad. His training methods were brutal but surgical. He didn't just teach Sokka how to swing a sword, he forced him to confront his own insecurity, to stop comparing himself to benders, to realize that his strength wasn't in keeping up with them. It was in thinking differently than they did. The final betrayal, when Piandao dueled Sokka in earnest after revealing he knew his student was from the Water Tribe, wasn't meant to punish him. It was the last test. Could Sokka improvise under pressure, use his environment, fight like himself instead of like a bad copy of someone else? When Sokka did exactly that, Piandao didn't just spare him. He bowed to him. The greatest swordsman in the Fire Nation bowed to a non-bender teenager from the enemy's side and handed him a blade forged from a fallen star. That wasn't generosity. That was recognition. Piandao's membership in the Order of the White Lotus proved where his loyalty truly lay. While firebending officers like Zhao chased glory, burned libraries, and tried to carve their names into history with as much collateral damage as possible, Piandao chose a quieter legacy. training the kind of people who would rebuild the world after the war. He fought in the liberation of Ba Sing Se not as a walking artillery cannon, but as the reminder that strategy, adaptability and humility could stand shoulder to shoulder with any element. In the end, his greatest lesson wasn't that a non-bender could be as strong as any bender. It was that power without character is just noise, and that the sharpest blade in the world is useless in the hands of someone who doesn't know what they're fighting for. Most avatars are remembered for the enemies they defeated. Kyoshi has her continent-splitting justice. Roku has his volcanic failure and his warning. Aang has his impossible choice in front of a burning comet. Kuruk, the water tribe avatar who came before Kyoshi, is remembered for something else entirely. The things he didn't stop. A party boy avatar in an age of peace, a man who hunted spirits at night and laughed through the day, Kuruk is the cautionary tale of what happens when the bridge between worlds decides the bridge will hold itself. Kuruk was born into comfort, and that might have been his first curse. The world he inherited was relatively stable. Yang Chen, the air nomad avatar before him, had spent her life throwing herself into every conflict, every negotiation, every crisis until she carved out a fragile balance with her own exhaustion. Kuruk reaped the benefits. No great empire was on the rise. No single nation threatened to plunge the world into war. So he did what far too many people do when history gives them a quiet moment. He assumed it would last forever. He hunted, he surfed, he drank, he laughed. The avatar in wolf pelts, more mythic frat king than monk or sage. But balance never maintains itself. While Kuruk was busy living like the golden boy of the polar night, something else was happening in the shadows. Spirits, neglected, disrespected, pushed aside as humans expanded and industrialized, began to twist. Old grievances festered. Petty hauntings escalated into genuine threats. Little by little, the spirit world started pushing back. Where Yang Chen had spent her life mediating between spirits and humans, Kuruk treated those same spirits like pests to be exterminated. If a being caused trouble, he didn't negotiate. He tracked it, fought it, and, if he could, destroyed it. And then he met Umi. In the Northern Water Tribe, under those same moonlit skies that would one day witness siege and sacrifice, Kuruk fell in love. Not with a spirit, not with an ideal, but with an ordinary woman whose presence cut through the fog of his hedonism. She anchored him. For the first time, the man who'd always treated the Avatar title like a birthright began to glimpse what responsibility might actually mean. He was still brash, still reckless, but suddenly there was a future he wanted to live long enough to reach. A wedding. A life. Something normal in the middle of his impossible existence. That's why the spirits chose that moment to collect their debt. On the night Kuruk and Umi were to be wed, Ko the Face Stealer appeared. This was not some nameless monster. Ko was ancient even by spirit standards, a being known for punishing those who showed the slightest emotion in his presence. Kuruk had crossed him before, slaying lesser spirits, taking trophies, treating the spirit world like a hunting ground. On that night, in what should have been the single safest moment of Umi's life, Ko slipped through the veil and took her face. Not her body, not her life in the usual sense, her very identity. One moment she was there, smiling. The next, she was a blank mask where a person used to be. Kuruk did what any man would do in that moment. He broke. From that night on, the legend of the carefree avatar ended, and the nightmare of the ghost hunter began. By day, Kuruk kept playing his role. He laughed. He fought when he had to. He pretended for the sake of his people that the world was still in balance. By night, he plunged into the spirit world, tracking Ko and every other hostile entity he could find, waging a one-man shadow war. Bit by bit, he carved away at the spirit threats that had multiplied on his watch, as if each defeated monster could retroactively pay for the one he'd failed to stop. It didn't work. The spirits kept coming. Ko remained free, and the cost of Kuruk's private crusade mounted. The toll showed in his body long before anyone understood why. He aged faster than he should have. He looked tired in a way no amount of sleep could fix, like every journey into the spirit world left a piece of him behind. He drank more, not because he was celebrating, but because it dulled the guilt gnawing at him. Friends saw a charismatic avatar who partied too hard and shrugged it off as personality. They didn't see the man dragging himself back from spiritual battlefields no one else remembered existed. adding new scars in places human hands could never reach. The cruelest part of Kuruk's tragedy is that he wasn't entirely wrong. Spirits had become more aggressive. Human encroachment, pollution, and spiritual negligence were already warping the line between worlds. Someone had to stand there and push back. The problem wasn't that he fought, it was that he fought alone, and too late. Instead of doing the slow, boring work of building spiritual understanding while the world was still relatively calm, Kuruk chose reactive violence. Every spirit he slew may have saved lives in the moment, but it also deepened the rift Yang Chen had spent her life trying to mend. Generations later, the consequences of that era would surface in brutal ways. Humans like Admiral Zhao, arrogant and emboldened, felt no hesitation about exploiting spirit knowledge for military gain, using lore from places like Wanshitong's library to hunt the moon and ocean, spirits themselves in the name of Fire Nation victory. The idea that mortals could treat cosmic beings as targets didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew in the space where avatars like Kuruk had taught the world that spirits were game to be tracked, cornered, and put down. Kuruk died young for an avatar. Not in a glorious final stand, not in a titanic battle against some empire, but worn out, body and soul, by a conflict no one wrote songs about. His immediate legacy looked deceptively peaceful. No 100-year wars, no continents shattered. The real damage was subtler. He left behind a spirit world filled with grudges and a human world that had forgotten how fragile that boundary really was. When Kyoshi picked up the cycle after him, when Aang and later Korra faced spirit-driven crises that felt impossibly tangled, they were inheriting more than just Rava. They were inheriting Kuruk's unfinished penance. History is often unfair in how it remembers him. The lazy avatar. The one who partied. Those labels cling because they're easier than facing what his life actually represents. Kuruk wasn't lazy. He was late. He wasn't heartless. He loved one person so fiercely that losing her hollowed him out. His story isn't about an avatar who didn't care. It's about an avatar who realized too late that caring isn't enough if you wait until the fire is already at the door. In the end, Kuruk's real sin wasn't indulgence. It was assumption. He assumed the world would stay gentle because it seemed gentle when he arrived. He assumed balance could coast on momentum. He assumed he'd have time to grow up before destiny demanded anything serious from him. By the time he realized he was wrong, he was already running, already hunting, already throwing his life into a war between worlds that no one else even knew was happening. Some avatars die as martyrs. Kuruk died as a warning. Not that pleasure is bad, not that spirits are monsters, but that peace is not the same thing as safety, and that neglect can be just as deadly as open hostility. His life is a question echoing forward through the cycle. What do you do when you inherit a world that seems fine but isn't? Do you enjoy the calm and hope it lasts, or do you interrogate it, maintain it, and accept that unseen cracks are still your responsibility? Kuruk answered that question too late. The avatars who came after him didn't have that luxury. High on the shattered ribs of an air temple, there is an old man sitting cross-legged in front of a bowl of fruit that no one else ever eats. The wind howls through broken archways, prayer flags have long since rotted away, and the monks who once filled these halls are nothing but soot on the wind. But he is still there, breathing, meditating, waiting. For 100 years the world thought the air nomads were gone, but the air temples were not empty. Somewhere among the abandoned courtyards and crumbling towers of the Eastern Air Temple, Guru Pathik lit incense, brewed tea, and kept a vigil no one had asked him to keep. While kingdoms rose and fell, while the Fire Nation drew new borders in flame, he sat on a lonely cliff and prepared for a boy who, as far as anyone knew, had died a century ago. Pathik was never an air nomad, not by birth. No arrows on his forehead, no shaved head or saffron robes. But the air temples had always drawn wanderers, sages, seekers, people who cared more about enlightenment than passports. Pathik was one of them. He came as a young man and never left. He studied with monks who could bend the wind and monks who could not, learning that airbending was only one way to move energy. The real art lay beneath the elements, in the currents of chi that flowed through every living being. That was where he met monk Gyatso. The two of them must have made an odd pair. Gyatso, the prankster monk who believed enlightenment and pie fights weren't mutually exclusive. Pathik, the human tuning fork who could feel the emotional static in any room the moment he walked in. One taught kids to fly on air scooters. The other taught grown men to sit still long enough to hear their own thoughts. Somewhere in the middle of all that laughter and silence, they became friends. When Pathik later recognized Ang by the smell of the baby he once helped change, it wasn't a joke. It was proof that he'd been there, in the temples before everything burned. When the Fire Nation came, Pathik survived what the air nomads did not. Maybe he was gone on a journey. Maybe he hid in the cracks between the worlds. Maybe the same intuition that made him a great spiritual guide screamed at him to get out just in time. However it happened, the result was simple and terrible. He came back to ruins. No children racing through hallways, no sky bison crowding the courtyards, just empty stone and the echo of bells that would never ring again. He could have left. Most people would have. Instead, he stayed. Pathik understood something almost no one else did. The Avatar wasn't dead. He could feel it, like a distant drumbeat in the ocean of spirit, a stubborn knot of energy that refused to dissolve. The world believed the Avatar cycle had broken. Pathik knew better. Somewhere out there, in ice or in spirit, Ang's light still flickered. The question was not if the Avatar would return. It was whether anyone would be ready for him when he did. So Pathik built his life around a future conversation. He studied energy the way other people study history or warfare. While scholars wrote about bending forms and military campaigns, he mapped the invisible, chakras, emotional blockages, the way fear, shame, guilt, grief, lies, illusion, and earthly attachment twisted the flow of power through the human body. Years later, people would write entire analyses of Ang's spiritual arc, breaking down how each of those blockages mirrored his trauma and growth across the series. Pathik had already done that homework alone on a mountaintop, with nothing but memory and faith as his textbooks. When Ang finally arrived at the Eastern Air Temple, Pathik didn't react with shock. He reacted like a host whose late guest had finally shown up for dinner. He knew Ang's name, he knew his scent, he knew the history etched into the boy's shoulders, even if Ang himself barely understood it. To Ang, Guru Pathik was a weird old man with questionable beverage choices. To Pathik, Ang was the answer to 100 years of meditation. Their training wasn't about fancy spirit tricks. Pathik didn't teach Ang how to shoot lasers or summon ancient beasts. He sat him down on a stone and told him the harshest truth any Avatar ever hears. The power you're afraid of is already inside you. The problem isn't that you don't have enough. You're clogged. He walked Ang through his life one chakra at a time, forcing him to name and face everything he'd been running from. The guilt of abandoning his people, the shame of surviving when they didn't, the grief of losing Appa, the fear of failing the world, the illusions he held about who he was allowed to be. Each chakra was like cracking open an old wound. Each release hurt. Each one made Ang lighter and more dangerous at the same time, and then they reached the final gate. Earthly attachment. Of all the things Ang had carried, this was the one he refused to put down. He could let go of the monks who died, the childhood he lost, even the notion that he ever should have had a normal life. But Katara, the idea of releasing his attachment to her, not his love, but the gripping, terrified need, felt like dying. Pathik told him he had to open his arms, to love without clinging, if he wanted full access to the Avatar state. Let go, not of her, but of the fear of losing her. Ang tried. For a moment he actually managed it. He rose, glowing, balanced on that knife's edge between human and cosmic. And then the universe, in its usual sense of timing, threw a vision of Katara in danger directly into his mind. Faced with the choice between ultimate power and the girl in the crystal catacombs, he chose like a 12-year-old boy. He broke the meditation. He ran. From the outside, that scene is about Ang. From Pathik's perspective, it was something else. The moment a century of preparation slipped through his fingers. He didn't chase Ang. He didn't scold him. He didn't try to force the lesson. Pathik understood what Gyatso had understood generations before. You cannot drag someone into enlightenment. You can only open the door and step aside. So he watched the Avatar turn his back on the final chakra, watched the boy he'd waited a lifetime to meet choose attachment over ascension, and he let him go. That's the quiet heartbreak of Guru Pathik. He's a man whose entire purpose coalesced into a handful of hours with a single student, and that student walked away incomplete. He did everything right, studied, waited, listened, prepared, and still the story refused to resolve cleanly. The war didn't end because Aang mastered the Avatar state that day. It ended much later, in a way no guru could have predicted, through a choice that bent the rules of balance without breaking them. Pathik never sees that victory. As far as the story tells us, he remains at the Eastern Air Temple, continuing the same routines, meditating, brewing tea, perhaps talking to ghosts that only he can feel. He's the last human thread connecting the living world to the air nomads as they actually were, not as statues and stories remember them. Through him, Aang gets one final gift from his lost people, not a new bending technique, but a framework for understanding himself. In a series full of warriors, kings and prodigies, Guru Pathik is something rarer, a man whose heroism consists entirely of being there when someone else finally shows up. No armies, no titles, just patience. He's proof that not all great battles are fought with elements or swords. Some are fought on a thin mat of woven reeds, in silence, against the part of yourself that would rather stay stuck than risk becoming who you're meant to be. And sometimes, the bravest thing anyone can do for the Avatar isn't to fight beside them. It's to sit on a mountain for 100 years and trust that one day they'll finally walk up the steps. There are some people born into tragedy, and then there are people born with a cosmic debt already on their ledger. Princess Yue was the second kind. From her very first breath, she was living on borrowed time, carrying a contract with the spirit world that had only one possible ending. The miracle wasn't that she eventually gave her life to save the moon. The miracle was that she got 16 years at all. Yue was born during a brutal winter night in the Northern Water Tribe. Not just sick, dying. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, her body refusing to commit to life. The healers tried everything. They bent, they prayed, they whispered every remedy passed down through generations. Nothing worked. Her parents, Chief Arnuk and his wife, knelt beside a daughter who would not wake, watching the hours slip past like sand. There's a special kind of helplessness that comes with being the most powerful people in your nation and still being completely unable to save the one person who matters most. Then her father did something desperate. He carried his dying infant to the Spirit Oasis, the most sacred place in the North Pole, where Tui and Leia, the moon and ocean spirits, swam in an eternal circle. He didn't have a plan. He had a plea. He laid his daughter in the water and he begged. The moon spirit heard him. Tui, ancient and patient, swam close. And then something extraordinary happened. The spirit gave Yue a piece of its own life. The water glowed. The infant gasped. And when Arnuk lifted his daughter from the pool, her eyes were open and her hair had turned the colour of moonlight. Pure, impossible white. She was alive. But she wasn't entirely hers anymore. That's the weight Yue carried from her first conscious moment. She wasn't just Chief Arnuk's daughter. She wasn't just a princess with responsibilities and expectations. She was a walking, breathing loan from the spirit world, and the terms were unspoken but absolute. One day, the debt would come due. Growing up under that knowledge changes you. Most kids get to be reckless, to make mistakes, to believe, at least for a little while, that they're invincible. Yue never had that luxury. She knew, in the marrow of her bones, that her life wasn't guaranteed. That every sunrise was a gift she hadn't technically earned. Other girls in the North Pole dreamed about freedom, adventure, love. Yue dreamed about being worthy of the life she'd been given. So she was perfect, or at least she tried to be. She studied. She learned diplomacy, history, healing, every skill expected of Northern Water Tribe royalty. She never complained. She smiled through the weight of expectations, the arranged engagement to Han, the reality that her future had been mapped before she was old enough to hold a pen. If the moon spirit had saved her for a purpose, she would fulfill that purpose flawlessly. That was the bargain, even if no one had explained it in words, but perfection is exhausting and lonely. When Sokka arrived, this goofy, overconfident water tribe boy from the south who looked at her like she was a person instead of a symbol, something cracked. For the first time, someone treated her like she had choices, like she could be more than duty and destiny. They spent one night together under the light of the moon, and in those hours Yue let herself imagine a different ending. Maybe the debt didn't have to be paid. Maybe she could just be a girl who fell in love with a boy, and maybe that was enough. Then Admiral Zhao showed up with a sack and a plan to murder the moon. It's hard to overstate how insane Zhao's gambit was. Killing the moon spirit wasn't a military strategy, it was cosmic vandalism. He'd learned about Tui and La from Wan Shutong's library, piecing together that the spirits took physical forms as fish in the spirit oasis. And in his desperation to win the war, to carve his name into history, he decided that permanently removing the moon from existence was an acceptable price for Fire Nation victory. He captured Tui, pulled it from the water, and held the fragile koi fish in his hands like it was just another weapon. The moon vanished. The sky went dark. Every waterbender in the world, including the warriors desperately defending the North Pole, lost their bending in an instant. The balance didn't just tilt, it shattered. And in that moment, Yue felt it. Not intellectually, physically. The thread connecting her to life pulled taut, and she knew exactly what it meant. She'd always known. Somewhere in the quiet parts of her mind, in the nights when she stared at the moon and felt its light humming in her veins, she'd understood that this was coming. The debt. The ending written into her first breath. Sokka begged her not to. He'd just found her. Just kissed her. Just started to believe that maybe the universe could be kind for once. But Yue looked at him with that sad, ancient calm that people get when they've already made a decision, and she said the only thing that mattered, someone had to. She walked to the pool. She knelt beside the water, and she gave back what had been borrowed 16 years earlier. The light returned, not just to the moon, but to Yue herself. For a moment she glowed, radiant and whole, every piece of her aligning with the purpose she'd carried since infancy. Then she closed her eyes. Her body dissolved, and Princess Yue became something else, the moon spirit, swimming in circles with the ocean, holding the balance that Zhao had tried to destroy. The tragedy of Yue's story isn't that she died young, it's that she was never really allowed to live as herself. From birth, she was a vessel, a placeholder, a temporary arrangement between a desperate father and a generous spirit. She was loved. Absolutely. Her parents cherished her. Sokka loved her. But even that love was tinged with the knowledge that she didn't fully belong to the mortal world. She was always, in some fundamental way, on loan. And yet in her final act, Yue claimed ownership over the one thing that had never truly been hers, the choice. No one forced her into that pool. No one demanded the sacrifice. She could have turned away, let the world figure it out, let someone else carry the weight. But that wasn't who she was. She'd spent 16 years trying to be worthy of the life the moon spirit gave her. In the end, she proved that worth by giving it back. Sokka carried her memory for the rest of his life. Every full moon was a reminder, not just of loss, but of the girl who chose the world over her own happiness. It's the kind of grief that never fully heals, the kind that turns into a quiet ache you learn to live around. He'd loved her for days. She'd loved him for the brief shining moment when she let herself believe she could. Princess Yue didn't get a long life. She didn't get freedom, or adventure, or the chance to see who she might have become outside the shadow of destiny. But she got something rarer, the absolute certainty, in her final moments, that her life, borrowed, brief, and burdened, had mattered. The moon still rises every night. And if you know the story, if you remember the girl with white hair and impossible kindness, you understand that balance isn't free. Someone always pays the price. And sometimes, the person who pays it has been preparing their whole life for that single, perfect, heartbreaking moment when they finally become what they were always meant to be. So there you have it. 10 more chapters from the book the show never wrote. 10 more stories that lived in the margins between episodes, in the silences where the camera didn't linger, but the world kept breathing anyway. Avatar. The Last Airbender gave us 72 episodes of brilliance. Battles won, friendships forged, destinies fulfilled. But those episodes were never the whole story. They were highlights, snapshots, the moments big enough to demand our attention while 1,000 smaller, quieter truths unfolded just off screen. We saw Aang master the elements, but we never saw the centuries of air nomad festivals that taught Gyatso how to be the kind of teacher Aang needed. We watched the White Lotus liberate Ba Sing Se, but we didn't see the decades those old masters spent playing paisho in tea houses, building trust across enemy lines one tile at a time. We felt Zuko's anguish over his missing mother, but we weren't there the night Ursa made her impossible choice, trading her life for his, walking into exile so he could one day walk into his destiny. These are the stories that shaped the world we fell in love with, the ones that explain why Bumi could wait 100 years without breaking, why Zhong hated fire even though he was a master, why Jet became the monster the Fire Nation created, and why Yui always knew, somewhere deep in her soul, that her life was borrowed time. The beauty of Avatar was never just about the kids who saved the world. It was about the monks who raised them, the deserters who protected them, the forgotten tribes who adapted when the world changed, and the spirits who demanded payment for debts mortals didn't know they owed. Every person Aang met, every ally, every enemy, every random cabbage merchant whose cart got destroyed, was carrying their own invisible weight, their own untold history that made them exactly who they needed to be in that moment. That's what made the show extraordinary. Not the bending, though the bending was incredible. Not the action, though the action was flawless. It was the understanding that every character, no matter how briefly they appeared, was the protagonist of their own story. They had pasts that scarred them and futures they were fighting for. They had reasons, sometimes good, sometimes terrible, but always human. The world didn't stop being complicated when the Fire Lord fell. Balance wasn't achieved because one 12-year-old refused to kill. It was achieved because 100 generations before him built the framework, the White Lotus, the spirit oases, the philosophies, the failures, the lessons carved into stone by avatars who tried, stumbled, and left breadcrumbs for whoever came next. Avatar understood something most stories forget. History isn't made by heroes alone. It's made by the people who waited on mountains for a century, by mothers who sacrificed everything in silence, by deserters who chose honor over orders, by orphans who never got to be children, by the ones who lost and the ones who survived and the ones who became something else entirely just to hold the line until someone braver could cross it. These lost episodes weren't lost because they didn't matter. They were lost because 72 episodes could never contain the entirety of a world 10,000 years deep. But they were always there, in the way Aang smiled like Gyatso taught him, in the way Zuko carried his mother's last words like a shield, in the way the moon rose every night because a girl with white hair understood that some debts are worth paying, the stories between the stories, the quiet moments, the impossible choices made in rooms no one remembers. That's where Avatar lived. That's where it still lives, waiting for anyone curious enough to ask, what happened when the camera looked away? The answer is everything. Everything that mattered happened in those spaces. And now, you know.